One day, trouble knocked on the house, and then Grace firmly locked the door. The servants politely greeted the young lady upon her return home. Grace looked intently at the butler and told him to answer her question. She looked at him with fury and asked why the house was such a mess. From birth, Grace Winoston had everything that others could only dream of. She was the only daughter of Duke Winoston, a nobleman highly regarded by the imperial family. She grew up as the heiress of the house, gifted with incomparable beauty, which she received from her charismatic father. But more importantly, she had the power to protect everything she had. A year ago, an incident happened at the birthday party of the heir to the throne. She looked at everyone present with rage and asked why they were looking so intently. Indeed, they seen people being beaten. The lady fought 17 nobles at the celebration, although it was more like a beating as punishment, and she was banished for a year. Such measures would have forced many to fall to their knees and beg for forgiveness, but the Duke of GTM's daughter refused to admit guilt and only hated her father. She swore that she would throw every potato from her harvest in his face. She worked hard all year on the lands. She looked at the butler and asked if her father had married again. He looked at her puzzled and said that it was so. The butler said that the Duke fell in love with a dancer 20 years ago, but because of the difference in social status, he had to take the Marquise's daughter as his wife. However, at the moment when the former Duchess became pregnant, it turned out that the dancer was also carrying a child under her heart. The dancer went missing, but the Duke managed to find her while Grace was away, and it turned out that she was actually a former Duchess who was unfairly kicked out. The butler told Grace that her mother was branded a villain in high society, and Grace did not say anything because she was worried that it would hurt her. She understood that he didn't care about her feelings and was worried that she wouldn't make a fuss. Grace asked where her father was. The young lady went to her father, DGTM's office, but as she passed by, she saw a new interior in the house. She looked at the curtains in surprise and asked how long ago they started decorating the estate with the symbol of their enemy. The maid looked at her and said that it was his lordship's order. The maid said that she doubted that Grace had the right to challenge his decision. The butler asked Madame Marille what she was talking about. He said that the lady was the heiress of the house, and she had the right to express her opinion. Madame Marie said his lordship has already made his decision, and even the heiress cannot argue. Gray looked at the maid and asked if she knew what this drawing was. Madame sighed heavily and said that these were just tulips. Grace looked at her and asked if she knew who uses tulips as a symbol. Madame hesitated. Grace told the maid that she claims that the heiress cannot show herself when the sign of the enemy of their family defames the halls of the estate. Madame said the Duke allowed it. Grace told her to stop repeating the same thing like a parrot. She said that their house swore allegiance to the imperial family, and tulips are the sign of the House of Monascus. This family leads the anti-emperor faction. Grace asked if Madame thought her reaction was not justified. Madame froze in bewilderment, not knowing how to answer her question. Grace looked at her and said that she didn't even introduce herself, but had the nerve to stand up to the heiress of the family. Grace asked Madame if she would now say that she was wrong. Madame was furious because she knew that the lady should apologize for the sins of her mother. The young lady understood that it seemed she only needed to deal with her father. The lady said that this time she would close her eyes, since she was not the one who hung these curtains, and told Madame to choose her expression. Grace told Madame to show that her mind has at least some value. Madame looked at Grace with fury. Madame Marille was very angry, but could not object to anything. Grace asked where Elena is. She is the new chief maid. Grace said they couldn't just send her personal maid away. Madame said she worked in the stables. The young lady came closer to her and told her to immediately bring her and return her previous job, and she would punish them. Madame and all the servants looked after the young lady in numbness. Without taking his eyes off the documents, the Duke asked his daughter if she had already returned. The young lady looked closely at her father. DTM's office and saw new portraits, but she did DG might see hers. She looked at her father and told him to explain to her what was happening. The Duke looked at his daughter and asked if Butler hadn't DG'd me, told her anything. She looked at him and said that he told her everything, but she would like to clarify something. The Duke looked at her and asked if he still had to explain everything to her. The young lady was puzzled. She looked at her father and said that it hurt her to hear such things from him instead of words of greeting. He told her to change her attitude before dinner. The Duke asked if she realized that she shared the blame with her mother. She said that if her mother was to blame, then she would ask his new woman for forgiveness. Grace said that otherwise he would have to spend his whole life atonement for his guilt towards her and his mother. The young lady did not have time to open the door when Lady Grace fell out and was surprised. The young ladies looked at each other intently. The Duke screamed and called his daughter. A moment later, he ran up to her and asked if she was okay. Grace looked at them intently as she realized that it was her half-sister, and she was the daughter of a dancer. The Duke looked at her and asked if she could stand up. Cadia said that she was fine and was just scared and stumbled. He asked if she had any pain. The Duke asked Grace why she was so careless. Grace said that people usually don't fall so dramatically. Grace wanted to quickly leave the office, but suddenly ran into Madame at the door. The young lady looked at her intently as she realized that this was the new Duchess. The Duchess said that she was very sorry that their meeting had been so chaotic and that she would like to introduce herself properly at dinner. The Duke introduced Gray's mother and daughter and said that now they will burn everything together, so they need to treat each other with respect. The young lady was puzzled as the image of an ideal family appeared before her eyes. She said that she was tired and asked permission to leave. The Duke angrily shouted at her in the race, but she just walked away. She was angry because her mother was cast out and then replaced with a new woman and half-sister while she was gone. She thought that they too could be victims, but not the mother, but the father. She knew that he was probably responsible for everything. She knew that now her anger would not help matters. She wanted to let them enjoy playing family. She only wanted to become the head of the family, and that DG teams all. The next day, the maid burst into the mistress's room with a smile. Grace smiled and told her that she understood that she was glad to see her, but there was no need to fuss so much in the morning. The maid said with tears in her eyes that her lady had lost weight. Grace seemed a little tired yesterday. She couldn't believe she was so happy to see a familiar face. Elena smiled and said that she brought her breakfast some time later. Elena helped Grace with changing clothes. Grace asked if her food had been spoiled. Given the behavior of the head maid, she was sure that they would spoil her food. Elena said that the food should be fine, since she took it herself, and no one changed it for the kitchen worker. The young lady said that she was pleased to know this, since now she would not have to get rid of another group of servants. Elena looked at the mistress in surprise and asked if she was really going to drive away the servants. Grace said that now the estate is a mess. Grace said that she was convinced that the main maid was looking for death. She tried very hard to make her angry. Yesterday, Elena asked what the mistress was up to. Elena told the lady that she was not sure whether she should speak, but there were unpleasant rumors circulating in high society. In a trembling voice, the maid said that many suspect that her father wants to change the heiress. The young lady angrily hit the table. The maid was shocked and shuddered in fear. The young lady was very angry. She of course expected this. She said that in this case, she needed to find support. Grace told the maid to prepare everything for the trip to the imperial palace, as she wanted to ask Her Highness the Princess for an audience. Sometime later, the young lady greeted the princess. The princess smiled and said that it had been a long time since their last meeting. The princess said that she canceled the hunt with His Majesty when she heard about her arrival. Grace asked the princess for forgiveness and said that she asked for a meeting because there was a very important matter. The princess looked intently at the lady. Grace told the princess that perhaps she already knew what happened in her family while she was away. The princess said that it was the scandal of the century. Grace said that she did not believe that her mother would do such a thing. The princess asked whether the reason for her belief was affection or logic. Grace said that if she had to choose the latter, if her mother had wished to get rid of the dancer and her daughter, she would have dealt with them forever. She said that her mother was known for her attention to detail, and she would not have made such an oversight. The princess said that she did not have time to investigate. She said that she was not here to ask for help with her mother's case. She said that she heard that her father wanted to change the heiress. The young lady said that her support system is no longer as strong, and she may have difficulty even getting help from within her family. The lady said that she asked the princess to put her wishes above her father's, despite all the rumors, since she is the Winostine family. The princess said that she heard the Duke loves his youngest daughter very much. She asked the lady if it hurt her because of this. Grace said that she never expected love from him because she had nothing to lose. The princess said that times are difficult now, but she is still glad that Grace is back. The princess smiled and said that she would wait and hope for her victory. The young lady was glad that the rumors did not change the princess's opinion of her. She thought that somewhere inside, she had allowed herself to become overly concerned about this possibility. A moment later, walking down the corridor, she noticed the silhouette of a young man. She looked to the side in surprise and asked who was there. The young man turned around puzzled and looked angrily at the young lady. Grace was shocked. She looked at the young man and asked who he was and why he was walking freely around the palace. Coming closer, she didn't notice anyone and became wary. Looking out the window, she wondered if the young man was a magician. The young man sighed heavily and said that all this annoyed him. But still, he understood that the young lady couldn't do anything to him. Grace was confused. She didn't understand where he had gone. She was a little wary because her eyes met, and then he disappeared. She remembered his gaze and wondered if he really was running away. Grace understood that he looked too calm. She thought it would be better to ask the knights to keep an eye on suspicious characters. The young lady returned to the estate. She was politely greeted. She noticed that there was complete chaos among the servants. Grace looked at the butler and asked where Elena was, but the servant intervened. The maid looked at her with a grin and said that Madame is now getting Elena. The young lady was furious with what she heard. She did not expect this. A moment later, she asked the maid if this meant that Madame was beating Elena in the garden. The maid was taken aback. Grace looked at the maid and angrily told her to immediately bring Madame to her. The maid said, puzzled, that Madame was busy right now. Grace looked at her with fury. Grace said that since Madame is so busy, she should get rid of her personal work forever, and these girls should be driven away. A moment later, the young lady entered the garden. She was shocked by what she saw. Madame looked at Elena with fury and asked if she really could do anything. Madame said that if she thought she could relax, then she was mistaken. She said that her place was still in the stables. The maid trembled with fear and said that the young lady was the heiress of the house. Madame asked her if she really refused to understand. She said that his lordship is the only master of this house. Madame raised her whip. She said that the lady had already fallen out of favor with her father. Gray told Madame that she would be in her disfavor if she continued. Madame stood up and politely greeted Mrs. Grace. Noticed that Madame was impudent but knew her place. Grace understood that Madame was not mocking her, but she was not showing respect either. Grace saw that she had etiquette, since she stood up as soon as she entered. Grace knocked over the chair, and Madame fell. The young lady asked for forgiveness with a grin. A moment later, the young lady looked at the maid and told her to bring her a chair. Madame looked at the lady and said that she shouldn't behave like that because only criminals on the street do that. Grace said that she too can be considered a criminal. Madame asked in surprise how one could be proud of this. Grace asked her what she would do. Madame looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Grace asked her if she said that she was proud of her behavior. Would she throw her out or beat her too? Madame shouted that she would tell the Duke about everything Grace said, that she only prevented her from punishing the maid without reason. Madame shouted that Elena broke the rules, and she is the main maid, so she has permission to punish the servants. Grace said that the raid maid must obey the orders of the heiress. Grace told her to give her the whip. Grace looked at Madame with fury and told her to know that she would not dress with a spanking next time, as it would deprive her of her head. Grace told Elena that she was her personal maid and should learn something from her, because servants often adopt the habits of their masters. Elena said that she was very glad that the lady came, and also asked how she knew that they were beating her. Grace said that she just guessed. Grace said that she was very annoying. Madame Elena said that it was all because of the rumors about her mother. Elena asked if everything would be okay, since his lordship might raise this topic. Grace said that nothing would be okay. Elena asked what they would do. She said that the young lady needed to apologize to Duke. Elena. She understood that the lady would not apologize to her father. Grace said that she couldn't do it alone and needed to find information. She told the maid to send a letter to Lady Valeria. The young lady said that it was a huge scandal, and she probably knows about all the details. Doctors know about medicines, knights know about swords, and rumors are best known to the diamond of high society. Grace understood that her old friend would want to make a dramatic appearance. A moment later, the young lady rushed into Grace's arms, asking Grace how she could do this to her. She said she hadn't heard a word from her. The young lady asked if Grace knew how worried she was. Grace, in turn, sighed heavily, but did not answer. Grace quietly whispered that the young lady could ruin her makeup. The lady smiled and said that the makeup was moisture-resistant. She asked if Grace had been living under a rock all this time. The young lady sighed heavily as she sat down on the sofa and said that this image tired her. Grace smiled and asked if she was still playing her games. She said that they were starting to think that she had two personalities. Grace said that she didn't expect her to show up so quickly. Valeria said that she didn't really want to come, but rumors would have spread if she hadn't shown up. Grace said that they were friends. The young lady looked at her intently and said that everyone thought so. Everyone called them white and red roses. Adelita people were convinced that they were the perfect example of friendship. Grace could boast of unforgettable beauty, like a scarlet rose. Valeria had the grace of a white rose and graceful features. She is also always polite and kind-hearted, which is greatly appreciated by others. But this is just an image from childhood. She had to pretend so as not to become a threat to the heir. Therefore, she pretended not to be interested in family affairs. She focused on relations with the nobility, portraying a naive girl. Gray looked at her and said that you want her to tell everything about the new Duchess and Cadia. Valeria said that she heard that her father wants to choose another heir. Grace said that this information interests her because the rumors may be confirmed. She said that perhaps the high society is mistaken, but the problem is that the father seems too interested in his new daughter. Valeria said that she doesn't know much about the Duchess. She rarely attends holidays, except for evenings and tea parties. Some religions spoke harshly of the Duchess, but the imperial family dealt with them. Cadia is very active in high society, but spends time only with little-known nobles or people without titles. Some knights who did not inherit the title and who had lands tried to propose to her, but she rejected them all. Grace was surprised. Grace realized that she would need to talk to her sister in person. Grace said that's all she wanted to hear, and now she'd like to ask her for a favor. Grace said she wanted her to look into her family's case from 20 years ago. Valerie asked if she was talking about her mother's charges. Grace said the rumors probably got out, and people had to talk about it. Grace said that she was right, but such a request was difficult to fulfill, and she would have to risk her reputation. Grace looked at her with a smile and said that she had nothing much to do right now. The young lady looked at her in surprise. Grace said that he would give her a good income plan, and it would bring her a lot of profit. Grace said that she could tell her if she accidentally heard something interesting. Valeria said that she agreed. Grace said that she would only create it. Valeria asked if she was really trying to negotiate, even though she had nothing to offer. Grace, she said that she just returned a couple of days ago, and she is still sorting out the situation in the world. Grace said that she had better fulfill her part of the deal when the plan appears, and if she brings good news, then Grace will help with the money. Valeria smiled and said that she already liked it. After her friend left, she was invited to an unwanted dinner. The Duke looked at his daughter and said that it was difficult to see. Her Grace told her father that a friend had come to see her. Grace said that her friend takes care of her, unlike her father. Madame was furious. Grace realized that Madame had told her everything. The Duke asked her who allowed her to see her friend after bullying the servants. Grace looked at her father in surprise and asked what kind of bullying he was talking about. She looked at them and asked with a grin why she didn't remember anything like that. The Duke angrily hit the table and shouted at his daughter. She calmed her husband down and said that there was no need to shout. The Duchess said that Madame told them everything, and that Grace was very angry yesterday. Dirt sighed heavily and said that everything was true, and there was a reason for this, since Madame just beat her personal maid. Grace said it would be weird for her if she didn't do anything. Everyone was shocked by such a statement, because they did not expect to hear something like that. The Duchess wanted to know if it was true. The Duchess looked at Madame and asked if she had raised her hand against the maid. Madame was shocked. She said that she had no choice, because she did not obey, and punishment goes hand in hand with discipline. Grace said with rage that she had never hit a servant in all her years, and no one had dared to contradict her before. Grace glared at Madame and said that now there is one arrogant head maid. Grace, in turn, closely watched everyone. She saw her sister calming the maids who were crying in the corner. Grace looked at the maids and said that she drove them away, and also asked why they were still here. Cadia asked Grace for forgiveness and said that she asked them to stay since it was her fault. Grace looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Cadia said that she should have watched them better and that it was her fault. Grace said that she is still the heiress of the family, and her father scolds her by punishing the guilty maids. She said that this would not have happened if her mother had been there. She told her father that perhaps he was furious because he hated a woman called a villain. She told him that he never wanted her to be his daughter. The Duke shouted that her head was filled with some crazy speculations. She said that her patience has a limit, and there is no need to push her to the edge, because he knows that no one will be a worthy replacement for her. She said that his brothers and their children have been waiting for a long time for a chance to take his place, and no one is able to resist enemies like her. The Duke had to admit that no one could save the family. He knew that no one was able to repel any enemy except his Grace. The Duchess looked at Madame and told her to apologize to Grace. Madame and the Duke were shocked by this statement. A moment later, Madame approached the young lady and asked her forgiveness. Grace looked at her and said she didn't accept her apology. Grace said with a grin that the beta came up and begged for forgiveness to Alain. She knew that the head maid would soon cause her a lot of problems. Grace glanced sideways at the maids. Grace said that they can stay in the estate, but if this happens again, she will drive them out right now. The maids thanked the young mistress with a smile, as they were very grateful to her. The Duchess looked at the young lady and called her with a smile on her face. She asked if she would like to have dinner with them in the evening. The young lady was confused. She understood that she should have accepted the offer because she wanted to get to know her stepsister better. Sometime later, they were sitting and eating. The atmosphere was a little tense. The young lady pushed away one dish because she and her father couldn't stand it. The Duchess said that she was very sorry that Madame treated her badly. She said that she would definitely talk to her. Cadia said that her mother did not want everything to turn out this way, since her father constantly agrees with her mother. BJTM's words, she did not know about the problem. Grace saw that her sister pretended to apologize for her mother, but she almost directly declared her father Jim's great love for her mother. Cadia said that in the future they will commit fewer bruises because they are trying to learn etiquette as quickly as possible. Grace didn't answer. She didn't care whether they learned etiquette or not. Cadia said that she is studying hard to become a noble lady like Grace. Grace said that you should not follow her example. The young lady hesitated a moment later. She said that it seemed like she would never be able to convey her thoughts correctly. Looking at Grace, she said that she wasn't trying to say that she wanted to surpass her. Cadia said that she just wanted you not to see a noble lady like in Grace. The young lady looked intently at her sister. A gloomy atmosphere reigned in the room. Grace looked at her sister and said that she misunderstood. Her Cadia asked what she was talking about. Grace said with a grin that noble birth is determined by ignorance or etiquette. Grace looked at her father and asked if what she said was true. The Duke hesitated and did not answer. Grace looked closely at her sister as she realized that she was more interesting than she had imagined. Sometime later, they ate in silence. The Duke and Duchess chatted pleasantly. Grace noticed that her sister was looking at her and smiled back at her. The young lady looked gloomily at her sister. She didn't even hear anyone calling her. The Duke called her again. He said that her birthday was next month. He asked if she had decided on a gift. Grace was a little confused because he remembered Cadia DJ T. Me's birthday, although he didn't DJ T. even know anything about hers. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't DJ Me need anything because she already had more than she could imagine. The Duke said that she probably still wants something. The young lady looked at her sister and said thoughtfully that in truth, there was something that she wanted. Cadia said that one day she saw her sister's library and thought it would be great to have all those books. Gray knew that this was a very tricky request, since her library was considered one of the most extensive among noble families. Grace said that she can take it for herself, since her office has everything she needs, literature, and she doesn't need a library. The young lady was surprised, but at the same time annoyed by her sister's answer. The Duke looked at her and asked if she wanted anything else. She said that she got more than she expected. Grace said that they could arrange a holiday. The Duke asked her what intrigues she was weaving this time. Grace said she was just suggesting that we have a celebration in her honor that would look like a debut. Grace looked at her sister and said with a grin that this was her first birthday as a member of their family. Cadia stared at her sister. She was very angry with her. Grace said it was her first birthday, and there was no way they could ignore it. For a moment there was dead silence in the room. No one said anything. A moment later, the Duchess said with a smile that she thought it was a wonderful idea. The Duke asked his daughter if she agreed with this. Cadia said that she certainly agreed, although she was not sure that she deserved it. Grace, leaving with a smile, said that everything had been decided and they would have a celebration. The maid looked at the lady and asked why she continued to bother his lordship. She told the lady that she could pretend to be nice to please him. The Duke treated Cadia very well. Grace said that she does not want to participate in such a thing, much less serve since she is an heiress. The maid was a little puzzled by the mistress Tim's words, because she thought that it could be done differently. A moment later, Grace wrote a letter. She looked at the maid and said that she fought every day to become stronger. Elena looked at the lady puzzled and asked what she was talking about. She said that she was becoming more influential because it was the only way she could raise her head and fight back those who mocked her. Grace said there was no reason to try so hard otherwise. Looking at the maid, she said that she will always try to protect herself, so she needs to work. Grace gave the letter to the maid and said that the beta sent it to the house of Count Luxon. She knew that beauty fades over the years. Sun and power does not matter. Before those who have higher status, she knew that only she could save herself, since only she was responsible for her life until the very end. The maid brought her lady a letter from the Winoston house. Valeria thanked her. The young lady was dumbfounded by the contents of the letter. A moment later she said with a smile that Grace was a fox after all. The lady told the maid to find someone who could help with the details of the contract, since she and Grace were going to start their own business. Valeria told the maid to ask the silk merchants in the capital to prepare the fabrics, as she would soon place a large order. The maid said, puzzled, that silk was in low demand. Valeria told her not to worry because he would soon become very valuable. She knew that it was unpleasant to admit it, but her friend BDJTM's plan would work. She knew that she also needed to prepare for the holiday. Grace might not have known at all what they preferred to wear now, because she was the one who set the fashion. Valeria sighed heavily, as everything irritated her. But still, she sincerely wished her friend good luck. She hoped that Grace would not suffer a crushing defeat. At the Winoston estate, preparations were in full swing. Everyone worked for the holiday, in honor of Cadia's birthday. Therefore, Madame stopped quarreling with Lady Grace, but contempt and resentment were still visible in her eyes. Cadia and Grace hardly saw each other. The heiress no longer came to family dinners. A few days later, the princess again formally summoned Grace to her imperial guards. The princess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she was very glad to see her. Grace bowed and said that it was a great honor for her. The princess smiled and said that now she understands where all these rumors came from. Grace looked at her in bewilderment. The princess said that they say you need to see her beauty at least once. Otherwise you can say that life is full. The princess said that she was really glad that the lady had become an imperial guard, and that she had something to do for her. The princess said that recently people with scarlet hair living in the capital began to disappear. The young lady was puzzled by what she heard. She asked if people with only scarlet hair were disappearing. About 200 years ago, a terrible belief spread throughout the empire that people with scarlet hair would bring death to the imperial family. The princess said that His Majesty assumed that the disappearances were related to a superstition. Grace said that these were just rumors. The princess said that this is so, but all the rumors become reality in the minds of those who believe in them. She said that if someone decides that the imperial family is behind the disappearances, Grace said that people will stop trusting the ruler. If this happens, opponents of the imperial family will take advantage of the situation. They have long tried to overthrow the first family of the state. The princess said that there is reason to suspect the House of Monascus because they have magic. Well, they will have problems if the House of Monascus is involved. The young lady said that investigations are always difficult when it comes to magicians. The princess smiled and said that Sirs, why she invited someone who could be useful. The young lady turned around a moment later and saw the young man. She was puzzled and looked at him intently because he seemed familiar to her. She was puzzled and wondered when he came since she didn't hear him. The princess said that the young man's name is Riku and he is a commoner. Grace stared at him without looking away. For some reason, Grace thought she had seen him somewhere. She was confused. The princess introduced the young lady and said that she would help the young man with the investigation. Looking at him, Grace realized that he was never a commoner. It had been a long time since she had met someone who would have caused her alarm by his mere presence. She looked at the princess and asked who this man was. She also asked if he was related to Monasca. The princess hesitated. The young man looked at her and asked if there were magicians who were not connected with Monasca. Grace looked at him in surprise. The young man said that all wizards belong to the Liberton bloodline. Magic originally flowed in the veins of the Liberton clan, but the blood of this clan mixed with someone else, JTM's, and lost its characteristics. She looked warily at the young man. Grace looked at him furiously, as she wondered if he was mocking her. The princess told the young lady not to draw the sword, since it does not belong to the house of Monascus, and is weaker than it seems. The young lady looked intently at the young man. A moment later, she said that he was a real wimp. The princess laughed. The princess said that he needs to learn a lot, since he is a commoner, and asked the young lady to help him with this. The princess looked at them with a smile and said that she hoped they would get along. A moment later, the young people found themselves alone. There was an oppressive atmosphere between them. Grace looked at him and asked if they had met before he said that they had not met. Grace looked sideways at him and told him to follow her, as Her Majesty told him to teach him. She said that he probably doesn't just even know the palace well and still needs to learn the rules so that the nobles don't condemn him. The young man ran forward and the lady looked after him in surprise. Rick said that he didn't need it. Grace looked at him in surprise. Rick said that he is a commoner and a magician, and he does not need the rules of the palace. Grace looked, but he had asked who he worked for earlier. Rick said he was just messing around at home. Rick looked at her and asked if he could go. Grace said he couldn't go. Rick said that he could just tell the princess that she taught him everything. Grace angrily asked if he was offering to deceive the princess. She asked him how he could even think about lying to the person he served and how he could involve her in his nonsense. Looking at the young man, she said that Her Majesty DTM's decree is a decree of the empire itself. The young lady sighed heavily. A moment later, she said that she needed to at least study the basics. She said with a grin that she would show him the whole palace first. A moment later, she took his hand and pulled him along. Rick was in shock. He screamed for her to stop. Rick asked the princess not to invite him to the palace when that woman was here. The princess was surprised and dumbfounded and looked at the young man. The princess asked if he was talking about Grace. Rick looked closely at the princess and asked if Grace really bothers everyone like that. The princess realized that it looked like Grace was teaching the young man. The princess said that the young lady's loyalty was amazing, and she should be respected for it. The princess said that he is someone who doesn't care about such things. Grand Duke Rankle Liberton. He thought for a moment and told the princess not to invite him to the palace when the lady was present. The princess looked after him in surprise and asked if that was all he wanted to say. Rick said that he would leave immediately if he saw her. The princess looked at him in surprise. The princess said what he could do, and so on, until the investigation into the disappearances began. A moment later, the young man finally left the Princess GTM's office. Rankle Liberton, Grand Duke Liberton. Many magicians ignore politics and titles, but Rankle simply refuses to respect such things. Even his own father scolded him for speaking to the emperor as if they were old friends. And when visiting the palace, he pretended to be a commoner, all this because he simply did not want to keep up appearances. Grace is loyal to the imperial family, and she is obsessed with the duties assigned to the nobles. It's fair to say that young people are complete opposites. The princess remembered how a few minutes ago he told her not to invite him to the palace when that woman was here. The princess was surprised because she had never seen such vivid emotions caused by someone. The princess thought for a moment because she realized that this would be very interesting. She knew that they were opposites of each other, and she was wondering what would happen next. The young lady slowly walked up to her room. As she walked, she thought about the young man who said that he was just a magician and a commoner, and he did not need the rules of the palace. The maid looked at the mistress and asked if something was wrong. Grace, puzzled, said that she remembered one eccentric. A moment later, she saw that the door to the room was open. She asked the maid if someone had arrived at the estate. The maid said that the tailor came to help the lady prepare for the holiday. Grace said that it did not concern her. A moment later, they turned around and walked in the other direction. The Duchess saw Grace and said with a smile that it looked like she had returned. The Duchess said that they were just choosing an outfit for Cadia. She asked Grace if she would like to join. She did not want to go to them at all, but she needed to find out what kind of clothes they would wear since they were having a celebration. A moment later, she looked at the young lady in shock. She was at a loss and did not understand what she was dressed in. Cadia asked Grace with a smile what she thought of the outfit. Grace was shocked by the outfit. The tailor asked with a smile if the outfit was not perfect for a lady. Grace angrily asked if the Monaska family really paid him. and asked why he dressed her up in strange rags. The tailor said that her ladyship approved of the outfit. Grace sighed, puzzled. The Duchess asked Grace if she didn't like her. Grace said that her row was too flashy. Sometime later, they sat and talked. The Duchess told Grace that she would like to introduce her to the new servants. She said that Grace only has one maid. She apologized and said that she should have taken care of it earlier. Cadia introduced the new maids, Ailey and Baron, with a smile on her face. Cadia smiled and said that she herself recommended them. Grace was wary, but she looked at her sister because she had a bad feeling. She knew that her sister just wanted to keep an eye on her and also to play dirty tricks. But Grace already knew that she did not have time for such proceedings. She wanted to keep an eye on her sister for now. Grace told the maid that she should start preparing for the holiday. She said that on her sister's birthday, her outfit should be bright and her dress should be made of silk. Elena looked at the new maids and asked with a smile if they could help with the bed. Elena said that she herself would help the lady change clothes, and they could prepare for the bed and bring food. The maids agreed. Grace watched them closely. They aroused her suspicions. Sometime later, someone knocked on the room. Grace saw Cadia, who was upset about something. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and called her because she didn't understand what was happening. A moment later, she threw the dress and fell to the ground. Cadia asked Grace why she did it. Grace was surprised and didn't understand what was going on. A moment later, the Duke and Duchess and some servants entered the room. The Duke saw his daughter sitting on the ground and Grace towering over her. The Duke angrily asked what happened here. He was very angry. Cadia said with tears in her eyes that she was very sorry, but nothing happened. Cadia told Grace that she would not have come to her if she knew that she would be against Grace. In bewilderment, asked what she was doing. Cadia, with tears in her eyes, said that they were commoners who did not understand anything, and she guessed that Grace did not like their choice. But still she was surprised when she saw that the dress was torn. The Duke said that he heard that Grace intervened. When her sister was choosing a dress, he was furious and did not understand why she tore up this option. The Duchess told her husband that it was not Grace DGCT's fault. All the servants were whispering, and Madame in turn looked at Grace with a grin. Grace understood that she was now surrounded by enemies, and no one could help her. Grace looked at her father and asked if he thought she did it. Gray asked why she should do this. Was it really because of their origin? She asked her father if he thought that she envied them or hated them. She said that in that case, she would not have offered to organize a holiday at all. The Duke, in turn, understood that his daughter was right in everything. He knew that if she did something, she would definitely admit it. She never apologized for her actions, even as a child. He did no DGTT like it at all, that she was his daughter, but he was more familiar with her character than anyone else. However, he knew that his poor daughter and her mother had suffered for a long time. He had not been with them for 20 years. The Duke knew that Cadia was his child, who deserved better. One of them was born from a marriage with the woman he was forced to marry. Grace grew up in luxury, and the other was the raft of his love. After many years of torment, she was finally able to get the title she deserved. He looked at the maid and said that this did not prove anything. The maid wanted to object. Grace knew that it was easy to prove someone's guilt, but it was more difficult to defend herself. She knew that it was very childish of Cadia to take advantage of her advantage. Grace said that they were right, and it was her fault. Everyone looked at her in bewilderment. Grace knew that her sister's plan had worked. Grace said with a grin that they were right, and she tore her dress. She must have known that this did not mean that she lost in this fight. The Duke looked at his daughter in bewilderment and asked why she did it. Grace said that she did it because she didn't like it. She said that all her outfits are of average quality. They can be easily found on the market, and the style has long gone out of fashion. Grace said that just looking at it made her sick, and she told her sister to throw them away, but she made a sad face and refused. Grace said that her father immediately attacked her and accused her of all her sins, and she didn't like it. so she agreed now she was doing her father a favor and hoped that he would back down. She understood perfectly well that he knew what would happen if he did Dijawe Mudal leave right away. The Duke understood her intentions. The Duke approached his daughter and asked if she would forgive her sister, since Grace is sometimes violent, but she would not have done so if she had been jealous of her. Cadia, with tears in her eyes, angrily said that she understands everything. Grace, in turn, closely watched the maids. Elena looked closely at her mistress and asked about the task, but why did she take the blame upon herself? Grace sighed heavily and asked whether Elena thought that if she had denied everything, she would have been able to justify herself. Elena looked at her mistress in surprise and asked if this was all okay with her. The young lady said that she was not entirely happy with this, since her sister managed to set her up. Grace asked the maid to ask the atelier to give her time and do something. The maid looked at the mistress and asked permission to remove the dishes. She also said that the atelier assures that she can visit them at any time. Grace said that she understood everything and also asked how things were going with the rest. Elena smiled and said that everything went well. Grace, in turn, said with a grin that everything was going great and that everything was for the sake of her dear sister, since she deserves nothing less. The maids trembled with fear. Looking at the South mistress a moment later, they said that it was time for them to go. Grace looked at them and told them to wait and also come closer to her. Grace looked at the maids and asked what her sister would do next. The maids looked at each other in bewilderment with fear in their eyes. They looked at the young lady and asked for forgiveness, said that they did not know. Grace said that Cadia sent them. She asked if they were not privy to her plans. The maid, puzzled, said that everything was not as they were taught to be faithful to Grace. Grace looked at them with a grin and said that they were silent yesterday. The maids looked at the young mistress in fear. Grace said that she gave them another chance. Grace said that they were maids, so they couldn't go against Cadia of Jutma's orders. She looked at them with a fierce look and said that there would be no more attempt. The young maids were taken aback and watched the mistress with fear. She looked at them and said that now they can go. Elena looked at the mistress and asked if she thought they would tell her everything. Grace said that this would be a warning to her. Grace knew that it didn't matter if her sister found out about this, but she would make her understand something. Sometime later, the young lady sat and read the letter intently. She was puzzled because she knew that someone must have silenced people 20 years ago. She understood that almost no one knew anything about what had happened. Then she realized that it seemed that everything would be more complicated than she expected. She understood that of course no one would allow society to gossip about it. Since the scandal affected the Duke's family, she still wondered if everything was being hidden too carefully, since it went beyond what her father could do. The young lady wondered if someone else was involved in the game, but still she did not understand why this was happening. Sometime later, while going about her business, she came across her sister. Madame greeted the young lady with a smile. Grace asked the governess if she had finished her lesson with her sister. The governess smiled and said that she had just finished everything. Cadia looked at her sister in surprise. Grace looked at Cadia and asked how it went. Cadia said with a grin that she is still studying, but is trying very hard. The governess smiled and told Grace that she cares about her sister very much. Grace, looking at the portraits, smiled and said that she was her sister and they would have to manage the family. The governess smiled and said that she understood everything and also said that it was time for her to go. A moment later, the sisters were alone. Cadia watched her sister closely. Grace told her sister that she was very diligent. Cadia said that she was, and she hoped that she would not harm the family. Grace looked at her sister with a grin and said that means she wouldn't VDJ team harm her family, since that was good, because she obviously didn't VDJ team care about such things. Grace looked at her sister and said that she was an heiress who out of envy had harmed her sister. She asked her sister if she was really seeking this mark. Grace glared at her sister and called out to her. Grace angrily told her sister that she had gone against her, but she still understood it. Grace looked at her and said that she could try to win her father, DJ TM's affection at any cost, but there was no need to get under her feet. Cadia drooped. She didn't DJ Tim to know what to answer. Cadia really wanted her father's love, but that's not all she needed. The attention of others. That's why she's trying to get rid of anyone who gets in the way, so people will turn their attention to her. Grace realized this yesterday, and for this reason, she figured out how to deal with her rude sister. Cadia walked up to the large portrait and gazed at her sister. She was furious because her sister annoyed her very much, and she wanted to end things with her quickly. Late in the evening, Grace came into the room where the dresses were. She knew that now it was time to show why everyone called her crazy. The next morning, the maids froze in bewilderment. They were in shock because they didn't know what happened. The maid looked at Madame puzzled and asked what they should do now. Madame Marille frowned and said thoughtfully that Lady Grace did it. Some time later, the Duke and his family entered the room and angrily asked what was happening here. Cadia was trembling with anger. The Duke angrily shouted to the servants to immediately bring Grace here. Cadia fell to the ground. She was shocked by what happened. She was confused because she didn't even know that Grace would do such a thing. Grace looked at her sister and asked what happened with a grin. The Duke looked at his daughter angrily and told her to immediately tell them what happened. Grace looked at her sister with a grin and said that she didn't know what he was talking about. Cadia was shaking with rage and could barely hold back her tears. The Duke said with rage that he knew that it was she who did it. She looked at her father and asked why she needed to do this. The Duke said that she was offended by her sister. Grace smiled and asked what kind of offense she was talking about. The Duke looked at her and said angrily that 2 years ago he stopped short and did not finish the sentence. The Duke turned around and saw that everyone was looking at him in bewilderment. Grace looked at her father and asked with a smile if he was talking about that story with the dress. She said that she had already taken the blame upon herself. Grace said with a smirk on her face that she kept silent about the fact that she was framed. Grace asked why she would do this if she knew that she would be accused. Grace said that even she became interested. She pointed her hand at her sister and said that perhaps it was she who tried to discredit her name 2 days ago. Grace looked at her sister and asked if she was saying it right. Cadia looked at her dumbfounded, but didn't answer. Grace walked closer to her sister and asked her with a grin what she thought about this. Grace said that she offered to organize a holiday for her, donated a library, and even wanted to find new dresses since something happened, and asked the Froze Atelier to accept them because they have the best outfits in the capital. Grace looked at her sister and asked with a grin if she really thought that it was she who tore the dress. Cadia looked angrily at Grace. The Duchess froze in bewilderment. She said that even she could not get a reception from the Froze Atelier. Grace calmly said that she knew the owner of the atelier. Atelier Froze is very popular among the nobles. Records can be waited for years. But for Grace, the studio makes an exception because she inspires workers. People who don't GTM know the truth can only believe Grace of GTM's words. Elena looked at everyone present and said with a smile that her mistress was right. Since yesterday morning, they agreed with the studio. Grace looked at her sister and asked if she heard everything and asked if she thought it was her fault. Grace stared at her sister. She was hoping that she would say exactly what she wanted her sister to say, that she didn't to do it. Cadia looked at her sister angrily. A moment later, the young lady changed her face and said with a smile that her sister had done nothing, and she knew that Grace was not to blame for this. Grace looked at her father and asked her sister if it was true. Grace said that she was very glad, because only her sister was the only one who believed that she was innocent. The Duke looked at them with anger. Grace said that now they need to find the culprit. She looked at her father and said with a grin that this is a very serious matter. The Duke said that she is right in what she says. Grace smiled and said that she was the heiress of this house, so she would like to get permission to take care of this matter personally. She said that she would certainly find the culprit. The Duke sighed heavily and still agreed with his daughter. Cadia looked intently at her sister while the maid encouraged her. Grace said with a grin that her father wants the criminal to look for the criminal, and this is very funny. Cadia froze in shock and bewilderment. Grace said it was her. Grace told Cadia that she hoped Cadia wasn't so naive as to believe that someone else was involved. The maids looked puzzled and angrily at the young masters. Grace looked at her sister and asked if something had really happened. She angrily asked her sister if she thought she could pin the blame on her and live in peace. Cadia told her sister that she could not even imagine how much that dress meant to her. She said that this was her first gift that she received at the estate. Cadia told her sister that she was petty. Grace asked in surprise if she really thought so. Grace looked at her sister with contempt and said that she deserved it. Grace walked up to her sister and told her with a grin that next time she should accuse her of something more serious. Cadia looked at her sister in shock and asked what she was talking about. Grace asked, with a smirk on her face, how about trying to poison? Grace said that then she could start spoiling her food. Grace told her sister to make a list of what she wanted done in her sleep. Grace said with a grin and anger that she promises that she will fulfill all her wishes. The young lady looked at the maids and said that last night someone ruined her sister's dress. Grace looked at the maids and said that she assumed that this man worked at the estate. She said that the criminal tried to prolong her crime. All the maids looked at the young lady in horror. She looked at them and said that she was now looking for the culprit. But as soon as the culprit is caught, she will vaporize him and shame him right in the square for everyone to see. The maid looked at the young lady and said that the dresses she ordered a few days ago were ready to be tried on. Grace told the maid to tell her that she would personally come, and she also told the maid to carry the clothes. Elena looked at the mistress and asked if she was planning to accuse the servant of a crime. Grace sighed heavily and said that, of course, she was not going to do that. She said that her father knew that she did it. Grace said that he didn't say anything only because of his beloved Cadia, who refused to blame her. Grace looked at the maid and said that she needed her to tell the maid something. Elena looked at the mistress in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Grace told her maid to spread the word that she had found the culprit, but did not want to reveal his name for the sake of the family's honor. Elena looked at the mistress and said that she was very noble and kind. Elena said that she thought she was too worried, looked at the maid, and asked with a smile if she really decided to argue with her. Elena smiled and said that she did not intend to do this and would tell everyone everything. Sometime later, the young ladies were sitting in the studio and having a casual conversation. Valeria looked at her friend and said that she was so merciless. Valeria asked how it was possible to tear all her dresses. Grace looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she always knew that she was very cruel. Valeria asked what her sister said to this incident. Grace said that her sister had not said a word in recent days, and she was probably coming up with a new evil plan. Valeria said that it looks like she decided to give up the fight. Grace asked in surprise whether it was because of such a little thing that she decided to give up everything. Valeria told Grace that perhaps she destroyed the dress that was dear to her because it was her first gift from their father. Grace said that she had known her father for 20 years and had never received gifts from him. Grace said that that was why she did not have such a stupid attachment to things. Valeria sighed heavily and said that it was very difficult. A moment later, a young lady came in and thanked them for waiting. Grace looked at her opponent and said with a smile that she had to go. The young lady was very glad that he would finally see the best silk dress that would soon come into fashion. Grace looked at her friend and thanked her for waiting for her. Valeria was stunned. She did not expect that the payment would be so wonderful. She looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she could not believe that they had created such a charming dress because it was simply amazing. The young lady smiled and said that the dress turned out to be a little more daring than she had intended. Grace smiled and said that she really liked the dress, She said that they could stick to this style when they finished. Grace looked at her friend and asked if she managed to capture everyone's attention. Valeria sighed heavily and said that she hated to admit it, but almost certainly she looked at her friend and said that the beta was not standing next to her at the holiday. Grace, surprised and smiling, asked her friend if she really looked so beautiful in the dress. But that DJ say, not the point. Valeria looked at her friend and asked if she would buy her a gray dress. She said that she had to do it because it was impossible to let her out naked on a holiday. Valeria frowned for a moment and thought she said that she understood everything, and now she needed to go home. Grace looked at her friend in surprise and asked if they were DGT going to eat together. Valeria smiled and said that they were not close enough to have lunch together. Grace looked at the young lady in surprise and intently. A moment later, she said with a smile that Valeria was a bad girl. The young lady was leisurely walking through the city and saw something suspicious. After looking closely, she saw Rick. Looking at him, she wondered if he was heading into the alley. The young lady, nevertheless, decided to follow him a little. In order to follow, she knew what was hidden in the alley, but still decided that she did not need to poke her nose into other people's affairs. She understood that it was better for her to leave and ask him both of them the next time she saw him. But a moment later, unexpectedly for her, someone grabbed her and dragged her along. She was confused and did not understand how he ended up behind her back. A moment later, the young man asked who sent her. The young lady was very angry and puzzled because she knew this voice. She realized that it was none other than Rick. The young lady was confused. Grace angrily grabbed the young man's hand and told him to let her go. Rick was shocked because he didn't expect it to be her. Rick froze in bewilderment as he saw Lady Grace Winoston in front of him. The young lady looked at the young man and angrily asked what he was doing. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she was here. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if he should explain to her what he was doing here, since this road leads to a brothel. She looked at him, son, with contempt and asked if he was going there. The young man looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said that she was just thinking about it and he wasn't going there. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was sure. Rick looked at her and said that he would never go there in his life and could swear on his life, and also asked her not to look at him like that. The young lady looked at him and said that she believed him. He sighed heavily and thanked her. A moment later, she still asked why he was in such a place. The young man hesitated because he didn't know what to answer her. He needed to figure out why people with scarlet hair were being kidnapped. The young man thought that Her Highness must be in despair to turn to him. He couldn't refuse her at all because he knew that magic was probably involved in this difficult matter. He spent days studying all the cases, but found out nothing. Rick knew that the first victim was close to Master Zack. The young man said that this was true, but he didn't know anything special about him. He was an ordinary worker, and sometimes he visited taverns and brothels. Rick knew that these were predictable answers, since there was nothing special about the man. Well, he knew all 4 victims. Rick said that the man seems to be finishing up with work, and he better hurry up. The young man asked Rick if he really wanted to talk to him personally. Rick said that he needed to check if there were any other clues, since he was the only one connected with all the missing people. The young man looked at the gentleman and asked if he would really go alone. Rick looked at the young man and asked what he was talking about. The young man said that Her Highness asked him to do this business together with Lady Grace. Rick told him to forget about it because that woman was nothing but trouble. Grace looked intently at her friend as she expected an answer from him. Rick looked away from the lady and sighed heavily. He said that in this place, now because he has business. The young lady realized that he was now investigating a missing persons case. She looked at him and said that she would help him immediately. The young man looked at her and said that he did not need her help. He asked her why she was following him. She looked at him and said that she had not been following him at all, and also asked if he really thought that she had nothing else to do. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked why she was here. The young lady said that this was the central area if he had forgotten about it, and she was just walking, and then noticed him. He was looking around suspiciously, so she decided to check. Grace, looking at the young man, said that those who serve Her Highness should not visit such disgusting places. The young man was surprised. He in turn asked if she was in love with the princess, since she kept talking about her all the time. He said that they are not interested in such things, and she can calmly leave. He said that she is only disturbing him, and if she wants to investigate, she can work on her own. The young lady thought for a moment, because maybe he's right, because she could become a hindrance to him. But after all, she saw that he was very weak. The young lady looked at him and called him. He looked at him angrily and asked what she needed. Grace, looking at the young man, said that the world was quite harsh, so he needed to be careful. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise. Grace looked at him and told him to let her know if he needed her help. Rick sighed heavily and said that he wouldn't need her help at all. Rick looked after the young lady in surprise. He understood that he would never be able to understand her, but still, he understood that he would not have to do this. Sometime later, the Duke shouted at all the servants and said that everything must be perfect, since Her Highness will be at the holiday. Grace, in turn, looked intently at her father. She said that even such a sight was funny to look at. A moment later, the maid called her mistress. The maid told the lady that a guest had arrived from the Froze atelier. Grace said that she understood and would come now, and also asked the maid to bring her sister. Grace smiled and told her sister that it was all for her. Grace pointed to all the dresses and told her sister to choose what she liked. Cadia looked at her sister in surprise and asked with a smile what it was. Grace smiled and said that she thought that she should pay for her mistake, and so she prepared a small compensation for her. Cadia knew that this was not an easy compensation, and at first glance, it was clear how difficult it was to arrange such a thing. Grace said that Cadia could buy everything if she wanted, or she would put them in storage if she didn't vamp like anything. Cadia looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she really wanted to put everything away in the warehouse. Grace smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and she would clean everything up immediately. Grace smiled and told her sister that she could leave them and then tear them off when she got bored, because that was what she liked. Cadia looked at her sister and began to speak, but Grace interrupted her and said that she could try on one dress. Grace went to the outfits and picked out one dress. Grace looked at her sister with a smile and asked if she liked the proposed dress. Grace told Cadia to try on the outfit. Cadia, in turn, was puzzled and didn't know what to do. Cadia knew that she should not agree to her sister's provocations. Grace guessed what she was thinking. Sister Cadia thought that if she accepted the gift, her father would think that she only cared about wealth, and she was only pretending to be upset that day. Grace knew that her sister wanted to pretend to be a sweet daughter who lacked her father's love. She always portrayed a modest, young, cheerful lady who expects nothing from her parents. Grace understood that her sister did not want her to destroy her image, but Grace knew that it did not matter. She wanted to show the young lady that it is more profitable to be a good sister than an obedient daughter. The young lady smiled and told her sister that everything was fine. Grace thought for a moment and said that it seemed like they had a problem. Gray asked her sister if she didn't like the dress. She asked if they should invite people from another studio. The young lady said that it is not so easy, she cannot accept such an expensive gift. All the maids closely watched their mistress. They were amazed by her, as she was very modest. Madame Marille, in turn, looked at the young lady with a smile, as she was proud of her. Madame looked at Grace with contempt and anger, as she, in turn, was very vain. Madame Marille knew that soon her days of arrogance would come to an end. Grace looked at her sister and said that she was not asking her to pay for all this, and that she would buy everything herself. The young lady's face brightened. She was happy, but still had a little objection about it. Grace looked at her sister and said that she did not spend money from the family budget at all. She said that everything would be paid from her pocket. Grace said that she runs various businesses because she has a lot of income, but maybe she doesn't have as much money as their family, but there's enough money for a dress. Grace smiled and said that she finally had a charming little sister, and the least she could do was give her an outfit. Cadia's face changed in the blink of an eye and said that she shouldn't do this. Grace looked at her sister with a soft smile and said that she wanted to do it. Grace said that she always pays the bills. Looking at her dear sister, she asked her to accept her. Grace asked her again. Grace, with a smile, asked if she would refuse her sister. The young lady froze in place. She didn't know what to do. Sometime later, the young lady appeared in front of her sister in a charming, but still she was very angry with her sister. Grace was a little surprised, as she could not believe that her sister was angry with her because of such a small thing, and for this reason she was only capable of tearing the dress. Grace looked at her sister and said with a smile that she was simply shining in this outfit. Cadia smiled and said that she could hardly be as beautiful as Grace. Grace said with a grin that this was clear without words. The lady looked at her sister and said with a smile that she could not accept such an expensive dress. Grace came closer to her sister and said with a smile that she could take him and not worry about anything. Grace said that she would be very angry if her sister refused her. The young lady became wary as her sister came closer and closer to her. A moment later, Grace came close to her and stuck a beautiful flower in her hair. Grace smiled and said that she knew he would suit her. Grace said that good girls should accept gifts. Cadia froze in bewilderment. She was in shock and did not know what to answer. Grace looked at her and asked if she did DJ tight dem like something. Cadia looked at her sister and said that this dress was enough because she was very tired and had a headache. The young lady looked at her sister and puzzledly thanked her for today and also asked if she could go back to the room and get some rest. Grace smiled and said that of course she could do it. Grace looked at Frome and said that her sister said she was very tired. Frome was a little surprised and said that the young lady seemed to be in poor health. Grace looked at Frome and said that it looked like she would have to try on the rest later, so she would buy everything they brought today. Cadia was in shock because she did not expect this. The maids whispered to each other as they were in shock. Madame looked at the young lady with rage and anger. Grace looked at her sister and told her to go to the room and rest, and later she could try on all the dresses since they were all hers. Cadia hurried to her room. She was very angry and did not know what her sister was trying to achieve. The maids looked at the young lady and asked if she would accept such a gift. The lady was taken aback and said that she could not do this and would ask her mother to return them later, since her sister had probably given a lot for the beautiful outfits. The young lady was puzzled and could not understand why her sister was behaving this way. A moment later, someone called the young lady. She looked down and saw Lady Valeria. Valeria looked at the young lady and asked if she had time. She asked if the lady wanted to join them for tea. Valeria said that usually only certain people are invited to such events, but Grace asked to leave one place for her, and she simply could not refuse her friend. Cadia knew that this was a very good opportunity for her, but she still understood that the time was not very right. The young lady was confused and could not understand what she was up to. Sister Cadia sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness and said that she was not feeling well today. Valeria looked at the young lady and asked if it was because of her. Cadia looked at the lady in surprise. Valeria looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and asked if she really hated her. Valeria asked her for forgiveness and said that she should not have appeared without an invitation, as it was very rude of her. The young lady was shocked because she didn't expect this. Cadia said that it was betmeety like that at all, and she didn't mean it at all. Valeria said that she heard that the young lady was interested in high society, and for this reason she wanted to help her. Valeria looked at the young lady and said that she was very sorry if she saw her as something. Cadia looked at her and shouted that she agreed. Valeria looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she was very happy and also thanked her. Cadia was confused and wondered why she felt like she was trapped. She wondered if everything would be okay. Valeria looked sideways at the balcony on which Grace stood. Grace, in turn, was very pleased as everything went according to her plan. Elena looked at her mistress and asked why she was so kind to Lady Cadia. Grace looked at her maid and asked with a grin if she knew what the most frightening feeling was. The maid was surprised and asked what it was. Grace said that it appears when a person realizes that he has met too formidable an opponent and cannot fight with him. Grace said that therefore she will show her all the beauty of the world by giving her the most expensive outfits, and then she will understand that she will never compare with her. Grace said that feelings of inferiority would consume her, and she would fall into despair. Elena looked at the lady and asked her permission to share her thoughts. Elena said that at first she was very worried that Lady Cadia would harm her using their father's support. Grace looked at the maid in bewilderment. Elena smiled and said that now she understands that there is no reason to worry about her mistress. Grace approached her maid and with a smile told her to repeat it again while she called her a joker. Cadia sat at the tea party absorbed in her thoughts. She wondered what her sister was up to. Cadia was confused because her sister unexpectedly showered her with gifts and allowed her to visit such a place. She felt lousy at heart. The young lady looked at Cadia and asked if she liked the cookies. Cadia was confused because she did not know the young lady who was addressing her. The young lady looked at her and said with a smile that her name was Magnet Yiron. Magnet said that she studied at the military academy with Grace, and she was one of the best groups. Cadia was a little surprised that the young lady studied with Grace. She knew that the young lady's family was one of the 7 who occupied the highest places in the Imperial Council of Elders, and she also studied with her sister. Magnet smiled and said that Grace helped her a lot at the academy, so she is very close to her. Magnet said that it was an honor for her to meet Cadia. Cadia was confused and didn't understand what was happening. She smiled and said that she was flattered. Magnet is that she was supposed to greet her, but was afraid that she would disturb her. Cadia said that everything was not like that at all. Magnet said that they could all just wait for an invitation, and Cadia, in turn, decided to join herself. Magnet said that, of course, Lady Grace was kind enough to choose them, and that VDG schemes how they met. The young lady was a little puzzled, because now she understood what kind of strange sensation she had felt earlier. Magnet said that this is a very great honor, since everyone, even in childhood, craved Lady Grace's attention, and they are all grateful that she allowed them to become acquaintances. The lady smiled and said that it was so. She was very excited. Cadia now realized that absolutely everyone had started drinking and belonged to Grace. She knew that this woman was simply terrible. Cadia understood that Grace never needed her father's love, and this irritates her very much. She knew she had to work harder to tarnish her honor and ruin her reputation. Cadia understood that she still needed to consult with Madame in order to make the right decision. She knew that she had to disgrace her at her own holiday. Valeria looked closely at the young lady. Cadia looked at Valeria and said with a smile that it was an honor for her to attend their tea party. She smiled and said that it was time for her to go home. Valeria set her up with a gesture. Valeria looked at the young lady and said that she wanted to tell her something. The young lady looked at her in surprise because she did not understand what she wanted to tell her. Valeria smiled and told her companion to try and not quarrel with Grace, since she is not her equal at all. Cadia smiled and, looking at the young lady, said that it seems that there was some kind of misunderstanding. She said that she values DJ, her sister very much. Valeria looked at the young lady and asked with a smile if she wanted to hear the story about the one who tried to harm Grace. Valeria said that Lady Grace was using her. The young lady looked at her as if she was bewildered. She asked why she was telling her all this. Valeria said that she was just warning her because Cadia reminded her of that girl. I said that Grace has one frightening feature. She uses people as if they were her chess pieces. The young lady froze in bewilderment. She was shocked by such words. Cadia did not respond to such words and simply left silently. Valeria looked after her intently. She said that the girl would not listen to her words, but she still knew that it was not important. Valeria knew that the young lady would understand everything when she experienced it for herself. Some time later, the young lady arrived home. Cadia was confused and very worried. She did not know what the young lady already meant. Grace looked at her sister and asked with a smile if she had fun. Cadia looked at her sister because she did know what to answer. For a while there was an awkward atmosphere between them. Cadia smiled and said that everything was excellent. And thanks to her sister, she met so many people. They were all kind. And she realized that she still had a lot to learn. Grace smiled and asked if it was true. The young lady smiled and said that was why she would do her best while studying. Grace smiled and said that she doesn't. Need to learn everything. She just needs to know how to control them. Then all their knowledge will become hers. The young lady was confused and did not answer anything. Grace looked at her sister and said that she needed to rest at her place, but still she should not forget her words. The young lady furiously clenched her fists and said that of course she would remember them. Madame saw her lady and ran to her in a hurry. Madame asked the young lady if she was okay, as she saw her puzzled expression. Madame was furious because she knew something had happened. The young lady said with tears in her eyes that she felt humiliated. Sometime later, with tears in her eyes, she told everything about Madame. Madame was shocked and couldn't believe it. She was angry. The young lady said that she was very embarrassed because this cruel girl openly boasted about everything she had, and it was very terrible. The young lady asked the madam if she should somehow pay her sister at her own party. Cadia asked if she should do anything to prevent her from hurting her again. Madame looked at the young lady and asked her with a smile not to cry anymore. Madame said that the young lady could rely on her, since she herself wanted to teach Grace a lesson, since she was rude to her. The young lady agreed with Madame and also thanked her with tears in her eyes. Madame was furious. She couldn't believe how someone could humiliate her lady. She knew that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, and Grace took after her mother. She wanted to use the last resort. Cadia looked at Madame Marille and said with a smile that she was the best. Grace stood quietly and listened to their conversation in the distance for a moment. She frowned and thought. Afterwards, the young lady performed her duties and also trained without any incident. The maids whispered while looking at the young mistress. They said that she was not a person at all, since she was constantly checking papers in the office, interrupting only during training and meals, and yet she did not look tired. One of the maids said that there was still a reason why she became the best academy graduate. They said that she was very beautiful, and you just had to look at her beautiful skin. The maid looked at her friend and asked if she thought that her skin would become as fair if she spent more money on care. The maid smiled and said that definitely not, and she would be lucky in the next life. The servants were rushing about, as everything had to be perfect, since there were only 3 hours left before the holiday. Grace, in turn, sighed heavily as she saw that the estate was a complete mess and looked more like a commoner's market than the Duke's estate. She looked at the maids and asked who allowed them to run around like that. The young lady looked at the maid and called her. The maid smiled and said that she was listening to her. Grace told Elena that she needed to get ready for the bath and start getting ready. A moment later, she noticed that someone was watching her closely. The young lady passed by Madame, and a moment later called her. Grace looked at Madame with contempt and said that reminds her that she only has 3 chances. Madame looked at the young lady with bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Grace looked intently at Madame and said that she had already made 2 mistakes. Walking closer to Madame Grace wished her luck with a grin. Rick looked at his companion in surprise and asked why he also needed to attend this celebration. The young man said that his master already knew the reason, since Viscount Dwinsor, the groom of the crown princess, suffered from a fall from a horse. Rick said that in that case the princess should have sent knights. Rick did if DJ TMC understand why he had to do all the work. The young man said that he also knew the answer to this question, since the princess wanted to send a magician to the holiday. Rick sighed heavily. He was confused because he did want to attend such events. When the princess can't attend the celebration, she sends herself the best magician in the palace to show how important the holiday is to her. Rick said that Grace doesn't care who comes, but she would still like to see the princess. He understood that it seemed that his dreams of a quiet life would never come true. The young man told his lordship to behave decently when he left the carriage and pretend to be a commoner. He was now a magician and not a duke. Rick looked at his companion and said that he knows everything. The young man thought for a moment and said that it seemed that the Duke did not understand. Something said that everything would only become more difficult for him if he did not pretend properly. The Duke in turn sighed heavily and said that this all irritated him very much. The young man looked closely at the Duke and said that he understood everything. The Duke said that today he would become a commoner. All the beautiful ladies were confused. When they saw the young man, they did not know who he was and did not think that they had seen him somewhere in the empire before. They whispered and wondered if this was an aristocrat from another state. They also thought that he might have recently received a title. Looking at him, they also assumed that he could be a commoner, but still they were skeptical about this, since he did not look like a commoner at all. The Duke sighed heavily, because for this reason, he did not want to come to such events at all. The servant stopped the young man and asked if he could look at his invitation. The servant thanked the young man with a smile when he provided him with an invitation. The servant looked at the invitation in surprise and dumbfounded as he realized that this was Her Majesty's guest in front of him now. Rick looked at the man and said that Her Highness could not come for personal reasons, and for this reason, she sent him to her place. The servant smiled and asked the young man to go inside. Rick was in no hurry to go inside. He looked at the man and said that he would like to see Lady Dirt first, since Her Highness asked him to convey something to her personally. The servant smiled and bowed obediently. He told the young man that he would immediately take him upstairs. The young man was shocked, since his master did not even remotely resemble a commoner. Rick noticed that inside the estate, everything was the same as on the street. Everyone was talking about him incessantly. The butler knocked on the door and told the lady that Her Highness asked him to give her something. Grace said that they could come in. The butler looked at the guest and opened the door and let him into the room. When the Duke entered the room, he froze as he was very surprised. Lady Grace looked at the young man in surprise and asked what happened to him. The young people did not answer this question. Grace looked at them in surprise and asked why they stood at the entrance. Rick came closer to the young lady and said that Her Highness sent him to the holiday. Grace was very surprised and asked her friend if Her Highness was okay. He is a little wary, as the young lady's tone immediately changed. Rick said that the Viscount fell from his horse, so to Her Majesty, his young lady was surprised and puzzled. She asked if Richard was hurt. Rick looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she knew the Viscount. Grace thoughtfully said that of course she knew him, since they were in the same year of study at the military academy, and Richard was the best rider. Rick thought about it, but didn't say anything, because the whole situation was a little suspicious. Looking at the young lady, he saw that she was very upset that the princess could not come to this event. A moment later, he snapped his fingers, and magic sparkled in the room, and the young lady looked at him in surprise. A moment later, the young lady had already won the beautiful necklace. Rick said that it was a gift for Lady Cadia from Her Majesty. Grace was surprised because this necklace was worn by the former empress, and such an expensive thing can be considered a treasure of the empire. He looked at her and said that she said the following quote, "This is the least she can give to the younger sister of her respected and precious knight." Rick knew that this must have meant a lot to her. The young lady was pleasantly surprised. Rick looked at her and said that he hoped that she would tell Her Highness that he had given a gift, and he also asked if he could go. The young lady looked at him in surprise. Rick said that he had done his job and asked if he could leave now. The young lady looked at him puzzled and asked if Her Highness had not asked him to personally present the gift to the birthday girl. She angrily asked why the princess would send him here. Rick was a little puzzled, since she had guessed everything and he would not be able to leave. She looked at him with fury and said that he was again trying to violate the order of the princess. Rick took his gaze away from the young lady and said that it was his fault and also asked for forgiveness. He said that he was very tired, so he lied to her. Grace looked at him and said that he would stay with her until the start of the holiday. The young man looked at her puzzled and asked why he should do this. She said that no one knows what problems he will endure if he ends up in the hall. She looked at him and said that she would not be upset at all if he was caught for insulting the imperial family, but still his actions greatly affect the reputation of the princess. Grace looked at him and said that he could act in his own way, but still she told him to behave decently until he handed over the gift. The young man looked at her puzzled, as he understood that he had no choice at all. He sighed heavily and still agreed with her. He said that in return, he wanted her to introduce him. When they went down to the hall, he said that if she was worried that he would cause her inconvenience, then it was better for her to still let him leave. The young lady looked at him and said that he was a skilled magician. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really had no ambitions. Rick looked at her and asked why he needed them. Grace said that people become complacent when they stop trying, and complacency leads to failure, and the same goes for her. The young man was surprised, and everything seemed strange to him, because she sounded too desperate for a person whom everyone praised. The young lady looked at her companion and said that it was time for them to go. The young man was a little puzzled, because he understood that something was wrong here. He understood that this did not concern him at all, and he did not want to interfere in such a thing. Grace came out and politely greeted all the guests who arrived for the holiday. The guests looked at the young lady with surprise and also politely greeted her. She smiled and said that she was very grateful to everyone for coming. She said she was grateful that they had decided to attend her only sister's birthday party, and she hoped they would enjoy the evening. She smiled and introduced the young man next to her. Grace said that it was the magician Rick who honored them with his presence, since he is present at the celebration today on behalf of Her Highness the Princess. Everyone was surprised that he had no last name and said that he was probably a commoner, but still, they were surprised where Her Highness got a magician if she did get along with the Duke of Manaska. Grace smiled and said that she would introduce him again when the hero of the occasion arrived. Sometime later, Valeria approached Grace and called her. The young lady looked at Grace and said with a smile that she was simply irresistible today. Valeria smiled and said that she did not at all expect that the young lady would choose a silk dress. Grace looked at the young lady and asked if she didn't like her outfit. Valeria smiled and said that Grace knows that she admires every outfit she wears. Valeria said that, to be honest, she was going to order silk clothes tomorrow. Grace looked at her friend and realized that their new business would go well. Grace smiled and told her friend that she hoped that she would cope with her work. Valeria smiled and told her friend that she wanted to tell her the same thing. Valeria looked in surprise at the young man who was standing next to her friend. Valeria came closer to him and asked if he was Her Majesty. She smiled and took him into account, greeted him, and also said that meeting him was a great honor. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and said that he was flattered. Grace in turn frowned, looking at him. Valeria looked at her friend in surprise, as the whole situation was very strange. As usually, Grace would have already said something. Valeria asked her friend if she knew him. Grace said that she did know him, only saw him twice. Valeria asked if it was true. Valeria noticed that the young people had such strange and interesting relationships for people that they met only a couple of times. Valeria looked at the young lady and said that she forgot to say that her brother was here. Grace frowned but did not answer. The young man approached them not long ago and with a smile told Grace that they had not seen each other for a long time. Grace looked at him puzzled and dryly replied that it was so. Rick was surprised at first and wondered why she sighed so heavily when she heard that the young lady's brother was on holiday, but now the reason was clear to him. The young man looked at Grace and said with a smile that he was going to visit her earlier, but missed such a great opportunity. He looked at her and with a radiant smile asked how she was doing. Grace looked at him intently and said that he shouldn't have forced himself to come. Rick looked at them in surprise. He wondered if the young lady understood that the boy was interested in her. The young man looked in surprise at Rick, who was standing next to Grace. He looked at Grace and asked who this man was. The young lady smiled and said that this was the magician sent by His Highness the Princess. A moment later, the young man quickly changed his face and said with a smile that he was very glad to meet you. Rick watched everyone closely. He saw that the festival was full of eccentrics. The Duke thought for a moment and thought that it would be better for him to stay away from the capital when this is all over. Grace looked sideways at the young man and said that they could see each other another time. A moment later, the guests once again greeted young Lady Grace. The young lady smiled and said that she was very pleased to see them all. While the young lady was talking with the guests, the Duke managed to run away. He sighed heavily because everything worked out for him. Some time later, the arrival of the Duke and Duchess was announced. The Duke looked intently at everyone present as he remembered that the birthday girl was Lady Grace's half-sister and they had different mothers. But still, he understood that this did not concern him at all. The Duke looked at everyone present and said with a smile that he was happy to see them all. He said that, as they know, Cadia is the lost daughter whom he managed to find 20 years later. He smiled and said that today they were celebrating her birthday, and he hoped that everyone would enjoy the banquet in her honor to the fullest. He smiled and said that now he would like to introduce the birthday girl. The young lady looked at everyone present and said with a smile that she was grateful to everyone for their presence, and it was a great honor for her. The young lady was taken aback looking at her sister. She was in shock. Cadia wondered if her sister had deliberately dressed up like that for her holiday. Everyone was whispering and saying that the two ladies standing and talking were much more beautiful than some. Rick heard the whispers and looked closely at the young ladies. Grace looked at her friend with a stern look and told him to come here. The young man sighed heavily. He understood that Grace was not giving him any rest. Cadia looked in surprise at her sister, who approached her and later turned her gaze to the young man. She was a little surprised because he was very handsome. She was puzzled by the fact that he was standing next to her sister. Grace looked at the young man and told her sister that this was Rick the magician sent by Her Majesty to them for the celebration. Grace said that Her Majesty had urgent business, but she sincerely wished to be at the celebration today. The young man snapped his fingers, and magic hovered around everyone present was surprised. A moment later, everyone saw a beautiful box in the hands of the magician. He looked at them and said that this necklace was worn by the former empress. Everyone present was shocked. The young lady was shocked and amazed. She wondered if this was the necklace of the empress herself. The young lady accepted the gift with trembling hands and said that it was a great honor for her. The Duke was surprised. He said with a smile that Her Majesty had sent them such a precious gift. The Duke smiled and said that later he would personally thank her for such a generous gift. Rick looked at the Duke and said that he didn't have to do this. The Duke looked at the young man with bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. Rick looked at the Duke and said that he would like to convey the words of the princess herself. He looked at the Duke and said that the princess said that this necklace was nothing compared to the devotion of Lady Grace Winoston. Rick looked at the Duke and said that the princess asked him to give this message to them. The Duke was a little angry because he didn't expect to hear something like that. Everyone present whispered because they knew that the princess highly valued the young Lady Grace, since she had faithfully served the princess for many years. Everyone said that it seemed that the rumors about a change of heir were groundless. Grace looked contentedly at everyone present, since by doing so, she had put everyone in their place. Rick asked Grace, with his eyes, whether he could leave the banquet. The young lady looked at the young man and nodded in gratitude, and also released him. Valeria approached her friend and with a smile asked if she secretly visited. Princess Grace smiled and said that of course she did. Valeria smiled and told her friend that she was a cunning witch, so the Duke would now not be able to influence the inheritance, since such was the will of the princess. Valeria looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why the princess herself did not come to the celebration, since such a statement would have had great weight. If she had said it personally, Grace looked at the young lady and said that Richard fell from his horse. Valeria was in shock. She looked at her friend and asked if the Viscount had fallen. She said that she didn't believe in it because the only good thing he had was character and the ability to ride a horse. Grace looked at the young lady and said that it was rude to say such a thing about Her Highness the Princess's fiancée. Still, Grace could not deny and completely agreed with the words of the young lady. She understood that there was something unclean in this matter. Richard fell from his horse on the day of the banquet. She suspected that someone did not want to see the princess at the holiday. Grace understood that the criminal probably knew how much Her Highness loved her chosen one. Valeria said that the Viscount would not just fall. She asked if he just missed the princess. Grace sighed heavily and said that he was not like that. Valeria sighed heavily and said puzzled that this was true. Valeria said, thinking that this situation is very strange. She looked at her friend and asked if it could be them, namely the Monasca family. Grace looked at her friend in surprise and puzzlement and asked if she really thought so. Valeria said that this is exactly what she thinks, because there was no one else to do this. She said she meant their eldest daughter and heiress, Ionel Monasca. Grace, in turn, knew the eldest daughter and heiress of the Monasca family very well since she studied with her at the military academy, and there were many similarities between them. Grace thought for a moment as the young lady had done crazy things before. She once spent the night with a commoner and then killed him for no reason. Ionel would take the life of any man without a title if he got on her nerves. Grace, thinking angrily, said that he would have big problems if the young lady was directly involved in this matter. Valeria smiled and said that she just made such an assumption. She said that the princess sent a magician to them, so everything was fine with them, and people still heard the princess DJTM's messages. Grace looked closely at the young man who was standing not far from them. Valeria smiled and said that she was very interested in why he was trying so hard to stay away from everyone. Valeria smiled, looking at her friend, and said that it was time for her to go, as she promised to chat with other ladies. Grace looked at the young man and asked if he wanted to join the fun, since he still gave the gift to the birthday girl. The young man looked at her puzzled and asked if he should do this. The young lady smiled and said that perhaps participation in the banquet would cheer him up or help improve his relationship. She asked him if he wanted to have a snack. He looked at her in surprise and asked why he should do this. He also didn't want to behave like that, but had to hide his true identity. The Duke would like to quickly leave this event, but she did not lag behind him. He knew that, even though he stayed, the lady still annoys him. The Duke sighed heavily because he knew that she was pestering him again and would not be so easy. The young lady looked at him intently. He looked at the young lady in surprise because he did not understand what she wanted. She smiled and said that perhaps this was also a good way to live. The Duke looked dumbfounded and bewildered at the young lady. Grace looked at him intently and said that he should still watch his actions since the princess entrusted him with a gift, which means she relies on him. Grace told him to behave accordingly. The Duke was a little surprised because he had previously thought that the young lady was used to imposing her opinion on people, but it seemed that this was not the case. He looked at her intently, with a smirk on his face as she intrigued him. Grace looked away from him and said that he had previously told her father that the necklace was nothing compared to her devotion. She asked if those were exactly the words of Her Highness the Princess. The young man looked away and said that she said so. Grace smiled shyly and asked if it was true. The young man looked at the young lady in puzzlement and surprise. He didn't understand what was going on. A moment later they heard a voice. The Duke looked at them and told the young lady not to let those words go to her head. The young man looked in surprise at the newly arriving Duke. Rick saw that the Duke was very nice to his second daughter, and heatedly looked with contempt. Rick wondered if none of the family members liked Grace. He also wondered if this was the reason the young lady was so obsessed with the princess. Grace looked at her father and asked if she could afford this. The Duke looked at her with rage and said that he knew that she was careful with Cadia because of the risk of changing the heir. The Duke said that he did not consider it a problem, but he also said that she should not dare to harm her because of such nonsense. The young lady looked at her father in bewilderment and asked when she managed to wound her sister. The Duke said that he knew everything about her character. The Duke said that the princess turned a blind eye to the mess she made at her birthday a year ago, but he remembered everything and knows. The young lady looked at her father angrily and fiercely. A moment later she said that he never asked why she did that. The Duke looked at his daughter and said that he never needed her excuses, and he would not show mercy if she ruined his daughter's holiday. The young lady smiled and said that she did but know that his daughter's gym birthdays were so important to him. She said that she did but even expect that he would personally come and warn her. The Duke looked at her with fury and told her to remember what a comfortable life she led while her sister was suffering away from home. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and asked if it had never occurred to him that sharing an estate with such a father was more difficult than being homeless. He looked at her with fury and asked what she was talking about. Rick, looking at the young lady, just grinned. He saw what kind of character she had. He understood that with such a straightforward approach, the lady probably made many enemies for herself. But it was precisely this trait that helped defeat them. The Duke looked at his daughter with fury and shouted that she had everything because she grew up as the only heiress. He said that she alone enjoyed what she had to share with her sister. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and asked what exactly she enjoyed. She asked if he was talking about the scars he gave her. The Duke looked at his daughter and said that he had never raised his hand to her. Grace looked at her father and asked if he remembered her 6th birthday. Grace said that she was waiting for him to return home, even went out to greet him late at night, and he pushed her, and after which she fell on a stone and injured her leg. After that, she had to give up short dresses throughout her childhood. Other children thought her wounds were disgusting. The Duke looked at his daughter and said that he scolded the rude people for this. She looked at him, sighing heavily, said that he forced them to apologize by threatening their parents. She said that no one would go against the Duke. Rick was confused because he wasn't sure if she didn't care about what happened or if she was just pretending. The Duke looked at his daughter angrily and asked if this was the reason why she was trying to ruin her sister Vd's holiday. The young lady smiled and said that no one knows. Grace smiled and said that everything depends on her sister's behavior. The Duke said with rage that she had a disgusting character, but her sister was different. The young lady smiled and said that it would be wonderful if it were true. The Duke looked angrily at the rain, but did not answer. A moment later, he left her company. Rick looked at the young lady and asked if it was true that she had scars on her legs. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that she completely forgot that he was here. She sighed heavily and said that it was true. She looked at him and said with a smile that they didn't matter because she had bigger scars because of the military academy. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she had to mention it then. Grace smiled and said that she said this to shut her father up. She said that she thought it would be a good idea to put pressure on his feelings of guilt, although she very much doubted that he had any. The young man thought for a moment and looked at her intently. He knew that the young lady had everything except what she really needed. He saw that she looked strong, but she also had a soft side. He saw that she was like a character from a second-rate novel come to life. But he also thought that there was more to her story. The young lady was a little surprised, as she had never received so many gifts before. She was used to spending all birthdays only with her mother, but of course, she wanted to be at such a holiday, but she had no idea how exhausting it would be. A moment later, someone called her. She looked back and saw her father. The Duke approached his daughter and asked with a smile if she was enjoying the banquet. The young lady thought for a moment about her father's words. Looking at everyone present, she herself wondered if she was enjoying the banquet. But the young lady knew the answer to the question. She did not enjoy it at all. Looking at her sister, she thanked her father with a smile. A moment later, she walked up to her sister and thanked her as well. Cadia smiled and said that she should have thanked her earlier. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and asked what exactly she wanted to thank her for. The young lady smiled and said that she would, of course, like to thank her for such a holiday, as it would not have happened if she had not offered. Grace looked intently at her sister and said that there was nothing special about it. Cadia looked at her sister and hesitated and said that she knew that the princess gave her something so valuable only thanks to her sister. Grace smiled and said that it was not like that because the princess just wanted to congratulate the birthday girl. The young lady hesitated and said timidly that, for the first time in her life, she was celebrating her birthday with many people. Everyone present began to whisper to each other because they thought that she was just a poor child. Rick looked closely at the young lady because he realized that she had said these words on purpose. He saw that she belittles herself to gain pity and concern for others. The young man saw that the young lady was the complete opposite of her sister. Rick was completely sure that Grace noticed this too. He was a little puzzled because he thought that they still had a wonderful family. A moment later, Madame presented dessert and said that it was a mousse one with ice cream. Madame, in turn, slowly cut the cake and the servants served dessert to all the guests. Grace was surprised and did not understand why Madame was cutting the cake herself. Grace watched Madame closely and wondered if Madame was up to something. Cadia came closer to her sister and asked with a smile if she would like to try a piece of cake. Grace looked at her sister and said that she does not really like sweets. The young lady looked at her sister in surprise and puzzlement and asked if it was true. Cadia, looking at her sister, asked for forgiveness and said that she baked the cake because she thought that she would also be happy. The young lady told her sister that she didn't know that she didn't like desserts. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she had baked them herself. Cadia looked at her sister and said, puzzled, that she had not baked everything, only one cake, the one she would like to share with her family. So she wanted to express her gratitude. The young lady said that she was not very skilled, and therefore this was the only way she could show her gratitude. All the guests present were surprised and said that it was very nice of her. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she really wanted her to try the cake. Grace looked at her sister very carefully, and a moment later she asked her sister if she was sure about this. Cadia smiled and said that of course she was sure of it. Grace smiled and said that she would try the cake as it looked wonderful. She asked with a smile on her face if she could have a piece. A moment later, the young lady took a piece of cake and began to eat. But after Grace ate a piece of cake, she suddenly felt sick and dropped the plate. Valeria was shocked, looking at the young lady she called her. Grace fell to the ground in front of everyone. Everyone was screaming and calling her because they were very worried about her. Grace, in turn, looked up at her sister and Madame and saw their contemptuous grins. The maid, in a hurry, ran up to her. Lady, everyone present was in shock. They were wondering if the cake was poisoned. The man shouted at everyone with rage and said that it was very impudent on their part and asked if they doubted Lady Cadia. He said that she baked the cake herself. The young lady was very scared, and looking at Madame, she wondered if everything would be okay. Madame waved at her and told her that everything would be fine, and she didn't need to worry. Madame, in turn, looked at Lady Grace with contempt. Gelotti causes vomiting even in the smallest doses. There is no smell or taste, and after a while there will be no traces left. But in large doses, the poison is fatal. Madame knew that there were too many people around today, and they preferred only a small dose. Madame knew that a small dose would be enough to make her ruin the celebration. As all people would think that she was trying to blame her sister, Madame wanted to spread a rumor after that would spread in high society. The young lady approached her father and asked what they should do. The young lady said that it seemed that her sister did not like her dessert. The Duke looked at his daughter and told her not to blame herself since it was not her fault. Cadia looked at her father and asked if he thought there was something wrong with her cake. She is a daughter, and with a soft smile, said that no one could ruin the cake when there are so many people nearby. The Duke said that they also tried it. The young lady wanted to see how her sister would react when her reputation in society deteriorated, but a moment later, they saw blood. Rick suddenly looked at the young lady and asked if it was blood. The maid was in shock looking at the lady. She said that she was bleeding now. Everyone present was in bewilderment and shock. They said that the young lady had definitely been poisoned, and someone had added poison to the young lady Tim's cake. Cadia looked at Madame. She was in shock because she thought that the young lady would simply vomit. Madame was at a loss because she knew that the poison could not cause coughing up blood. Madame was in shock and wondered what was going on. A moment later, Valeria rushed to the young lady. She was in shock and looked at her friend with tears in her eyes. Cadia froze in shock. She understood that something was wrong in this situation. Cadia, looking at her sister, saw that she was smiling. She was in shock. She didn't va DJ Tim to understand why Valeria looked at the young lady and asked if she was okay. Dirt didn't WDG Tim to answer anything. Grace was shocked because she asked Valeria to find something weak. Grace looked at her friend and said that she needed poison. Valeria looked at the young lady with a grin and asked who she wants to kill this time. Grace said that her dear sister and respected madam should add poison to her food. She discovered their plan, so she is preparing to take appropriate measures. Valeria sighed heavily and said that it makes sense, and also asked what kind of poison she needed. Grace said that she needed diluted willets, said that this remedy is used to treat wounds, but it is fatal if you drink it. Grace looked at her friend and asked if she understood what she was talking about. Valeria said that she would get him. Valeria asked why she was so sure that her sister would do this. Grace said that she knows her sister and she is very predictable. Her sister realized that Grace does not need her father's love. After the tea party, only Madam agreed to help her, and recently she found out that Madam bought poison. Grace said that now her sister, DJ Tim's banquet, is being discussed by the whole world, and this is a very ideal moment for an attack on her reputation. Valeria looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she would allow them to do this. She said that it would harm her. Grace looked at her friend and said that this would make them give up once and for all. Valeria looked at the young lady puzzled and said that it was very risky. She said that they could add a lethal dose. Grace smiled and said that their poison would not kill her. Even the one she wanted to take would not harm her. She said that it would be easier if they gave a lethal dose. It would make her sister much more interesting. Grace said with a grin that nothing would work out for them. Grace thought that drinking tea would convince her to reconsider her views, but still people did not change so quickly. Cadia was trembling with fear. She didn't might know what to do now. Cadia, in turn, saw her sister's evil grin. The Duke angrily told the services not to stand there, but to take Grace to her chambers. The Duke looked at the servants and told them to call the healer, but a moment later he said that they should first bring the doctor, and so that he would find out what kind of poison it was. The servants were scared and said that they would do everything. Grace was surprised. She saw that he was very excited. However, she understood that there was nothing surprising in this, since the heiress of the house was coughing up blood in front of many people after trying the cake prepared by her sister. She knew that nothing else mattered, because in the morning they would say terrible things about her sister. The maid looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes and said that the beta was holding on to her. Rick looked at Grace in surprise, as it was all unexpected for him. He realized that she was even crazier than he had previously thought. Grace, in turn, coughed up blood again. The maid, puzzled, ran up to her mistress and called her. Grace looked at the maid and told her not to scream, as she herself knows that she is immune to most poisons. The young lady looked puzzled at her mistress. and asked what if this particular one was not one of them. Grace looked at the maid and with a smile told her not to worry, as she had checked everything. Elena said with tears in her eyes that she was still in pain. The young lady did not respond to the maid DJTM's words. She knew that she was still uncomfortable, but still she knew that she should not show her weakness, since she needed to wait until her friend brought the healer from the temple. Rick walked into her room and looked at her puzzled. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why he had come. He looked at her furiously and said that he wanted to ask her a question. He looked at her and asked if she did this on purpose. He of course guessed that poison was added to the cake when Cadia began to beg Grace to try the sweetness. But he didn't say anything because he was sure that Grace knew everything herself. But he was very surprised when she accepted the treat and then started coughing up blood. Rick understood that she was poisoned and he should help her recover, otherwise the princess would be very angry with him. The young man came closer to her and saw that she was smiling while looking at her sister. He knew that she won, and her sister lost. In that smile he read that Grace told her sister that she would never defeat her, no matter how hard she tried. He understood what exactly her grin meant. He wondered if Grace had voluntarily taken poison to teach her sister a lesson. He was in shock and did not understand why she would go to such extreme measures. Rick looked at the young lady and asked what happened. He asked if she really allowed herself to be poisoned. Grace looked at him and told him not to force her to answer. The young man was shocked because he thought she was crazy. Grace looked at the maid with rage and asked where Valeria was. She asked why she had not come yet, since Valeria said that she had invited the healer in advance. Grace asked if she was really trying to kill her. The maid looked at her mistress with tears in her eyes, but did not answer anything. Rick said that all this was just annoying him. He looked at the young lady and said that she was very crazy. She looked at him and told him to shut up and go away. She wanted to add a few more words, but suddenly coughed. He looked at her and asked if she really wanted to remain an heiress. So much he asked if the title was more important to her than life. She looked at him and told him to shut his mouth because he didn't know anything. Rick looked at her closely and said with a grin that she was very unusual. A moment later she was illuminated by a bright light. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that she thought he specialized in wind magic. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he could really heal. Valeria entered the room and looked at her friend puzzled. She said that Grace looked too healthy. Grace looked at her and said that she was stalling for time in the hope that she would go to the other world. Valeria looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Valeria said that she had brought a healer for Grace of DGTE's sake. Rick looked closely at his friends. He thought that they were two in a kind, since Grace of DJTM's friend was also wonderful. Grace looked at the young lady and asked what the situation was in the banquet hall. Valeria looked puzzled at her friend and asked what she thought the situation was like. Valeria sighed heavily and said that, of course, there was complete chaos in the hall. Valeria said that everyone thinks that someone added poison to the cake. Valeria looked at Grace and said that everyone present did not say this out loud. Grace, in turn, was very pleased. The healer looked at the young lady and still decided to use magic. A moment later, the Duke entered their room and, looking at his daughter, told her to immediately explain herself. The young lady smiled, looking at her father, and asked if he was asking her about this. She said that she was a victim of poisoning. The Duke looked at his daughter with fury and asked if she thought that something had been added to the cake. Grace looked at her father and asked why don't they talk in private. The Duke looked at his daughter furiously and asked if that was all she cared about. The Duke angrily told her to imagine how many living rumors about his daughter Cadia would spread by morning. Grace looked at Valeria. Valeria wondered if Grace really wanted her to leave. The Duke looked at his daughter with fury and asked if she knew what state her sister was in. Now, the Duke of DJTM's sister said that she was crying now and had probably lost consciousness from tears. The young lady looked at her father and said that if she had not done anything wrong, she would not have ended up in this situation. The Duke looked at her with fury and told her to watch what she said about her sister. Unable to resist, he waved his hand at her in order to hit her. With the speed of lightning, the young lady grabbed his hand, preventing him from hitting himself. The Duke froze in bewilderment. She looked at her father and said with a grin that this time he tried to raise his hand on her. The young lady looked at her father and said that she wouldn't let him do it twice. She looked at him and said that, unfortunately, she had grown up since he hit her the last time. The Duke was angry. He looked at his daughter and asked how she dared treat him like that. The young lady said with a grin that she now has enough strength to resist him. The Duke was at a loss. He did not understand when she managed to grow up so much. He remembered her as a little girl when she was trembling and crying from fear. He looked at her with fury and asked if this was the real reason why she hated her sister, and she blamed her sister for stealing his attention. He asked if she thought it was because of her sister that he sent her away. Grace looked at her father with contempt and said that he sees the world in rosy tones, despite everything that happens around him. She said that it was a laugh, and only Grace said that he does not mean so much to her for her to hate someone because of him. She looked at her father and said that besides, she never despised her sister. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she could say such a thing if she had brought her so many problems. The young lady smiled and, looking at her father, asked, when did she bring problems to her sister? She said that it even sounded stupid, and she was throwing up blood because of the willets that she took. The Duke looked at his daughter dumbfounded and asked how she could do such a thing. Grace said that the fact is that Cadia ruined her portion. The Duke looked at his daughter with rage and asked if she understood what she was doing. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and said that she believed her sister would be accused of attempted murder while playing. She calmly looked at her father and asked what was wrong with this, as earlier she was the first to accuse her of damage to her wife. The Duke shouted with rage that a torn dress was very different from an attempt on life. Grace said with a smile that of course she looked at him and asked if no one stops her sister, does he think that she herself will stop doing this? The Duke shouted with rage that Cadia was a good and beautiful girl. Grace looked at her father and asked if good girls should ruin their sister's name. She looked at her father and said that earlier he said that the Duchess was a kind woman, but now perhaps she should still question his words. She looked at her father and asked what the word "vedjang good vgkj" meant to him. The Duke angrily asked what she was trying to achieve. He asked if Grace wanted to intimidate her sister. She looked at him with a grin and asked if this was his only guess. Grace said with a grin that he was terribly short-sighted. She said that he was not trying to intimidate his sister. The Duke looked at his daughter in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady looked at her father with contempt and said that she was threatening him, and the Duke in turn froze in shock. Grace said with a grin that any reasonable noble would think that her sister tried to kill her. She said that the truth does not matter, since rumors that a fire will spread through high society and burn Cadia to the ground. The Duke shouted angrily that he would not allow this to happen. She looked at him and said with a smile that, of course, he would do everything possible. She said that he could go right now and tell him that she poisoned herself. She looked at her father with a grin and asked if he thought that she had not foreseen such a turn. She asked if he really took her for a fool who was throwing around accusations without having evidence. The Duke, in turn, looked irritated at his daughter and said that he did not believe her. Grace said that Madame Marille cut her a piece of cake, and Cadia insistently asked to try her treat, and a couple of lucky statements would only fan the flames of rumors more. Grace looked at him and said with a grin that then his beloved wife would be involved in a scandal because it was she who brought this maid to the house. The Duke was in shock. He did not know what to say to his daughter. The lady said with a smile that she would certainly give them a magnificent performance. The stepmother and her daughter tried to kill the heiress of the house. Grace walked closer to her father and said with a grin that people would start looking for the true villain, and perhaps they would become interested in her mother's case. The Duke looked at his daughter with rage and said that this was very mean of her. The young lady came closer to him and said that this was not so, and on her part, it was very humane. Grace said that if she were truly cruel, she would have gotten rid of him and these women a long time ago. She looked at her father and said that he should have thought about his safety earlier, and he should have treated her with respect or hide all his weaknesses. The Duke looked at his daughter angrily and asked what she wanted from him. The young lady looked at her father with a smile because she saw that she had won. She said that first she would like to personally investigate this matter, then she will decide who is really guilty. The Duke looked at her in surprise, as he was stunned by her statement. She said she also wanted him to hand over the reins of the estates to her. Grace said that otherwise the lives of the women he loves would be ruined. After his daughter DJTM's words, the Duke DJTM's face dropped. He was in shock and did not know what to do. The young lady smiled and told her father that he had been in power for too long. Grace looked at him with a grin and said that now she wants him to come down to earth. She said that the chair of the owner of the estate no longer belongs to him. The maid looked at Valeria and asked, puzzled, if she thought Lady Grace would be okay. Valeria smiled and said that they hardly need to worry about her. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not understand what she was talking about. A moment later, they saw the Duke leave the room in annoyance. Valeria entered the room and asked her friend how it went. Grace smiled with satisfaction and said that the outcome was determined long before the start of their game. Valeria looked at her friend and asked with a smile what the fruits of her victory were. Grace thought for a moment. Grace smiled and said that nothing special happened. She just now manages the estate. She knew that she had gained power, so the result was not bad. Rick looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she really needed power that much. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked why he was suddenly asking her about this. She looked at him with a grin and asked if he really wanted to get something from her. The young man frowned for a moment and asked her if she could only reason within such a framework. He said that he asked simply out of curiosity. He said that he did not understand the willingness to make such sacrifices for the sake of power. The young lady thought for a moment about what kind of sacrifices she was talking about. She said that she had lost nothing. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she knew that her body could not cope with such poison. The young lady calmly looked at him and said that, of course, she knew about it. She smiled and said that risking your life for the sake of strength is not difficult. She asked him with a grin if he thought that the sweet taste of victory overpowered the pain. The young man was stunned by her statement. He mentally gave up, as he would never understand her train of thoughts. She looked at him and said that he had done a very good job today. She said that she was sure he understood that he would gain nothing from spreading rumors about the past. She looked at him and said that she would tell Her Highness the Princess that he had played his part, and Grace said that he could go already. Rick was a little puzzled. Magicians are able to see the essence of everything. He knew that he was the best of wizards, so he saw what was in most people's hearts, but its essence was inaccessible to him. In parting, he gave her a grin, and in the blink of an eye, he disappeared. Grace was a little surprised, as he had never experienced such emotions before in front of her. The Duke looked at Leon and called him. Leon looked at his master in surprise and asked if the banquet went well. The Duke said that it was not so. Leon asked in surprise what happened. The Duke looked at his assistant with a smile and asked if he thought a person could be brave and scared at the same time. Leon said, "It sounds as crazy as warm iced tea." The Duke smiled and said that he also thinks he said that it is simply impossible, but true. The Duke smiled and said that Lady Grace is the living embodiment of this irony. The young man was surprised and did not understand what the Duke was talking about. Leon wondered if the Duke had said that Lady Grace was afraid of something. The Duke understood that today he saw her for the first time, but he certainly would DG might call her frightened. He smiled and said that he thought that he would understand everything if he continued to watch her. Lion looked at the Duke in shock, as he wondered if he would be watching the young lady. He could not believe the words of his master. Grace looked at the maid and asked if her father had sent all the guests away. The maid looked at the mistress and said that it was so. Grace looked at the maid and asked where Madame Maril was. The maid said that it would turn out that Madame was escorting Lady Cadia to her chambers. Grace looked at the maid and said that she understood everything, and there she could return to work. The maid obediently agreed with the lady. Walking towards her sister's chambers, the young lady noticed that her door was ajar. Grace looked at her sister and asked what they would do. Now the young lady shuddered and looked at her sister in surprise. The young lady was shocked as her sister stood in front of her, safe and sound. Grace looked at the young lady puzzled and asked if she still had the strength to be angry with her. Cadia looked at her sister with fury and asked if it was she who did everything. The young lady told her sister that she took the poison on purpose. Grace looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if she had any proof of her guilt. Cadia asked in surprise what she was talking about. Grace smiled and told her sister to think about everything herself. Grace said with a grin that she baked the cake and she asked her to try it. Grace said that now Cadia claims that she was deliberately poisoned by it. Grace, with a grin, said that this is a very interesting assumption. She looked at her sister and asked if she found him interesting. Cadia said with rage that she said that this was not an assumption. Cadia, looking at her sister, she shouted that she was a cunning fox and raised her hand to her. Grace easily stopped her. She sighed heavily and said that they always try to slap. Grace looked at her sister with contempt and said that she took after her mother but had the same temperament as her father. Grace told her with a grin that she should have inherited her father's appearance and her mother's character. Since she did, she looked at her sister with contempt and said that she was poor. Cadia shouted at her sister with rage and anger and said that she understood what she was up to. Cadia said that Grace knew about everything from the very beginning. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and asked why she continued to scream, that she knew about everything. Grace said that this was stupidity on her part. Cadia was furious and screamed with tears in her eyes because she understood that she could not do anything. Cadia screamed at Grace and blamed her for everything. Cadia said that if we had DJTM to had Grace, then nothing would have happened. She wanted Grace not to have been born at all. Grace, in turn, looked at her sister angrily. A moment later, she asked her sister if Cadia remembered how many times she clarified whether she really should try the cake. Grace, in turn, looked at her sister with a grin and said that Cadia herself said that she would be happy if the whole family tried it. Grace said that it turns out that she is ready to deceive people, but gets angry when I answer her in the same way. Grace looked at her sister and asked if she really thought that everyone was as stupid as her. Cadia, in turn, shouted with rage that there was no lie. Grace looked at her sister and told her not to forget that she gave her madam a chance. She said that she was merciful towards them, like a saint. The young lady looked at her sister in surprise and asked what mercy she was talking about, since she always looked down on her and made fun of her. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and asked if she had ever made fun of her. Cadia told our sister that she always put her below herself, and for this reason she sent her to the tea ceremony. Grace said that she sent her there to introduce her to influential people, but still it offended her. Grace looked at her sister and asked if she only took away bad things from that meeting. Grace looked at her sister with contempt and said with contempt that her feeling of inferiority never ceases to amaze her. Cadia, in turn, could not stand it and raised her hand to her. She shouted at her sister to shut up. Grace caught her second hand and called out angrily. Cadia froze in bewilderment and shock. Grace looked at her and said that if she had done something like that in another situation, she would have simply retaliated in kind. And later Grace told her sister that she had the audacity to try to smear the name of the heiress in front of many people. Grace said that she almost lost her good reputation because of some pathetic man. Grace said that he would be honest when she heard about her sister until she was a little worried because she knew that she would remain the heir and only because of the fact that she was an only child. But she was okay, didn't do anything for the whole year of her absence. Grace said that instead of devoting herself to her studies and etiquette, she plotted and her pathetic plans were hardly worth the time spent. Cadia achieved nothing, even though she had a lot and could only play the role of a meek daughter who bows to her father. Grace told the young lady that she was not a threat to her in the first place because she lost before the war started. Grace pushed her sister away and she fell to the ground with a crash. Cadia looked at her sister with bewilderment and fear. A moment later, Grace took out her sword and looked at her sister with a grin and contempt. A moment later, the sword was near the young lady. Cadia froze in fear without uttering a word. Grace walked up to her sister and said with a grin that she doesn't care what Cadia thinks of her, but still because of her generosity, she gives her a choice. Grace came closer to her and said that she could fix it and live happily, or she could resist and end up as a broken doll in the dirt. Cadia, with tears in her eyes, trembled with fear. Looking at her sister, she said that she was very sorry. Grace looked at her sister in surprise and said that it was really fast. Cadia was trembling with fear and crying very hard. She screamed that she promised that she would not do this again. Grace looked at her sister and with a grin told her not to be afraid, as she would not kill her. Grace looked at her sister and said that she had one more chance left. She asked if the young lady remembered about this, sighed heavily, and said with a grin that someone had already spent all their chances. Grace looked at her and said that now it was time for them to leave, and they needed to try harder tomorrow. She looked at her sister and asked what she thought about this. Grace smiled and told her sister that she would find out about everything tomorrow. Grace looked at her sister, she would follow, and asked if Valeria told her about the girl who went against her and later began to serve her. Grace said that the lady from this story was Valeria herself. For some time, the young lady sat dumbfounded on the ground, without moving. The attempt on the life of the heiress of the Winoston family led to many becoming interested in the relationship between Grace and Cadia. The nobles believe that this is the key to the solution, so they base their assumptions on the interactions of the sisters, and the incident became the main topic in high society. Grace looked at everyone present and said that they had found the culprit of yesterday's assassination attempt. The servants looked warily at the young ladies and wondered who it could be. A moment later, all the reviews fell on Madame Marile. Grace looked at her and said with a smile that, honestly, she didn't believe there was anything wrong with the cake, even though she started coughing up blood after trying it. Since her younger sister baked the cake herself and Madame served it, Cadia looked at Grace warily and in surprise because she didn't know what she was up to. Grace said with a smile that Cadia is her dear little sister, and Madame is the main maid who served them faithfully. Grace said that that evening she did not eat anything else except cake, and after the incident, she thought about everything for a very long time. Grace smiled and said that her sister would obviously never poison her, so there was only one maid left. Madame came closer to them and firmly stated that she had been set up. Grace smiled and asked if it was true that she had been framed. Madame Marile looked closely at the young lady and said that this is exactly so. Grace looked at Madame with a grin and asked who needed this. Grace asked Madame if Madame Marile really thought that she was trying to slander her. Madame in turn looked intently at the mistress, but did not answer anything. The butler looked at Madame with rage and asked how she dares to blame the young lady for such a thing. A moment later, Grace stopped him before he could say anything. Grace looked at her and said that this was a very bold statement. She looked at Madame with contempt and with a grin asked if she really thought she was worthy of such an honor. Madame was very angry and could not answer anything. Grace thought about the update and said that it did indeed. DT matter, since it was a rhetorical question. She said that she was not interested in the answer at all. Grace looked at the head maid and asked if she really believed that she would accuse someone of such an assassination attempt if she did not have the appropriate evidence to prove it. Madame knew that she had no evidence, since she had already gotten rid of the bottle of poison. The bottles were broken into 1,000 pieces. Madame knew that the young lady would not blame her for anything. Grace looked at the maids and called them. A moment later, a maid came up to the young lady and brought her a small bottle. The head maid was puzzled and wondered what was in the young lady's hands, since she was sure that there was no evidence. A moment later, she saw that the young lady was holding bottles in her hands. She was in shock and could not believe what she was seeing. The young lady, in turn, looked at the small bottles with a grin. The head maid was at a loss. She didn't understand how she could have got it. The young lady looked at the maid and asked why she was so surprised. Grace looked at her with a grin and asked if he looked familiar to her. If there is no evidence, you need to create it. Grace could buy the poison from the same dealer. Grace in turn knew that if she uses the same one who sold the poison to Madame as a witness, then Madame will not be able to do anything to her. She will not be able to deny. Madame looked at the young lady with a puzzled expression and said in a trembling voice that they had really tried to slander her. Grace looked at her and asked with a grin if it was true. Grace asked if she should visit the dealer who sells such medicines. Grace said that she would ask if a certain Madame Marie bought Jaloux from him. Madame looked puzzled at the young lady and said in a trembling voice that she knew about everything. Madame was shocked, as the young lady had previously revealed her entire plan and still took the poison. Madame angrily asked if she had arranged all this to get rid of her. Grace looked at the head maid angrily and said that her stupidity could only be rivaled by her impudence. Grace said that she was very interested in whether the maid would stop talking nonsense if her tongue was cut out. Madame angrily asked the young lady if she understood why she did all this. Madame screamed that it was all because of her, since the blood of that dirty lady flowed in her. Madame angrily asked the lady what she thought of herself. Madame did not understand how the lady dared to look down on them. Madame shouted that she should bow his head before her ladyship and lady, and certainly apologize to them. Grace came closer to her and angrily said that she wanted something or experience. Grace looked at her angrily and asked why she thought she had the right to receive it. Madame looked at the young lady with bewilderment and anger. Grace said that it was just funny. Grace said that if Madame had behaved like that in front of her father, she would have considered her a charming woman and would have spared her. But Madame decided to contradict her. Grace asked with contempt if she really thought she was superior. Grace said that she had heard about servants who had the audacity to put themselves on a par with the nobles because they lived in the same estate with them. It seems she is the same. Grace called the butler. Grace told him to send a letter to the prison and ask them to bring their maid to her senses, since she does not know her place and is delusional. Grace said that she was guilty of an attempt on the life of an aristocrat. Therefore, she will remain in prison until the day of her death. All the servants were stunned by what they heard. Grace pushed the maid, and she fell to the ground with a crash. Grace looked at the servant and said that she suggested that she spend her time in prison, learning manners and learning the values VUDG of servants. Grace looked at the maid with contempt and told her to enjoy her imprisonment since they would not see each other again. Grace looked at Madame with a smirk and contempt and said that she would take her tongue as a parting gift. Cadia looked at her sister and asked if she was really going to send Madame Mariel to prison in Bern. Grace looked at her sister with pity as she saw that she was still terrified. Looking at her sister, Grace said that perhaps she should take care of her future before taking care of Madame Cadia. Angrily asked what was bothering her about her future. Grace looked at her sister and asked with a grin if she was really serious about this incident. Grace told her sister that she could now make her disappear. She said that she is not talking now about her stupid reputation in high society, and she can literally bury her underground. Cadia was taken aback after her sister DGT's words. Looking at her sister, she said that she doesn't DGT might have any evidence against her. Grace looked at her sister and said that it was very naive of her to think. So Grace said that she could always create new evidence if she needed it. Cadia was dumbfounded by her statement. She asked if this bottle was really found in Madame of DJ.TM's room, also her doing. Grace looked at her sister and asked if she remembered who exactly searched her room. Cadia was puzzled and did not understand why she was asking her about this. The young lady thought for a few minutes and understood everything. Grace said with a smile that it was Cadia who hired Ailey and Baron. Grace said that perhaps she hired the maids to frame Madame Merrill. Grace, with a grin, said that it really sounds convincing, and she is sure that many would believe it. Cadia was shocked. She looked at her sister and said that there was a witness. Grace smiled and asked if she was talking about the herbalist. Grace said that she thought she could bribe him since she has quite a lot of money. Grace looked at her sister and said that she would stop trying to resist if she were in her place. Grace, with a grin, said that the rule of this game is simple. Whoever she chooses will be the guilty one. Cadia looked at her sister with fury and said that she was going to tell their father about everything. Grace said that her father had already entrusted her with the entire investigation. After she threatened him with her future, Grace looked at her and congratulated her with a grin, because despite how useless she really was, she actually turned out to be useful this time. Cadia was confused and didn't understand how this could happen. Grace looked at her sister and said with a grin that if she didn't want to hear the herbalist's confession one day, then she should think about how to get on her good side. Grace looked at her sister with a grin and said that she still had a lot of willets, so she could say when she wants to try it personally. The young lady fell to the ground with a crash. She was taken aback because she was dumbfounded. Now she understood everything. Now she understood with clarity of mind that from the very beginning she could not win this tough fight against her sister. Some time later, the young lady read a letter that the criminal Madame Maril had been safely taken to the facility. She was glad that she had been dealt with. Grace looked at her maid and asked if she had recently told her that her sister was still locked in her room. Elena nodded in confirmation and said that this was true, and she heard that the young lady had not eaten for 2 whole days. Grace looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she was sure that Cadia was still alive. Elena frowned and thought for a moment, but a few minutes later she said that she believed she was still alive. Grace knew that it was obvious that the young lady remained in the locked room because she was very afraid of the threat she had made to her earlier. Grace, while drinking tea, told her maid that the young lady couldn't even handle it. She didn't understand why Cadia was trying to take on more than she could eat. Grace said that they say that fools are often brave, but Grace was sure that Cadia wasn't even brave, just stupid. Valeria looked at her friend and asked why she shouldn't feel fear. Valeria said that Cadia might have to live her whole life darkened. As the girl who tried to poison her sister, and to make things worse, her sister accidentally turned out to be Grace. Grace looked at her friend and said that she clearly told her sister that she would be allowed to live as long as Cadia behaved well. Valeria looked at her friend in surprise and asked with a smile if she really expected the young lady to believe this. Grace looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she should have told her sister. The young lady began to pretend. She said that she could go to her beloved sister and say that she would never kill her dear little sister so that she could relax and sleep peacefully because she would love her forever. Grace looked at Valeria and asked if this was what she wanted to hear. Valeria smiled and said that it sounded more threatening. Valeria said that Grace should act like a big sister and extend an olive branch. Grace sighed heavily and told her friend that it was easy for her to say that. Valeria smiled and said that of course it was easy for her to say this, since it was not her problem anyway. Valeria said with a smile that it was not difficult to say anything when it was not your problem. Grace was confused and did not understand what was the point of discussing such a topic with this young lady. Looking at the letter, she called her maid. The maid came closer to her lady and said that she was listening to her. Grace gave her a letter and said that it needed to be sent to Linda Dwyle, an economics student at the academy. Grace said that she was hiring her for the position of chief maid. Alina was shocked by the words of Mrs. Valeria looked at Grace with her mouth open and asked if she seriously wanted to do this. Elena looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she really thought that the young lady would agree to work here as the main maid. Grace looked at Elena and said that the head maid should help the Duchess in managing the household. Valeria looked at Grace puzzled and asked what this had to do with the young lady. Grace said that the household had fallen into disrepair because of their stupid head maid. For this reason, they needed to hire someone smart and proactive who had discipline. Grace looked at the maid and told her to get rid of the rest of the resumes since she still did DGTMRT like the people who applied. Elena looked at her mistress and said that according to rumors, even the imperial family wanted her. Elena was skeptical that the young lady would agree to this kind of work. Grace looked at the maid and told her to just send the letter. Elena obediently agreed and said that she would do everything. Valeria was shocked. Looking at her friend, she said that she was really up to something, since no one would have thought of hiring an academy star as the main maid. Grace calmly said that the young lady simply fits the bill, that DJTM's all. Valeria looked at her friend, puzzled, and told her not to make her laugh, and also asked if she really thought that the young lady would take on this job. Grace looked at her friend and calmly said that the young lady would take on such a job since she made her an offer that she could not refuse. Looking out the window, Grace said with a smile that the household would finally start functioning properly when they got a new maid. Valeria looked at the young lady and asked what to do with a crybaby who would not leave her room. Grace said that she was completely sure that her sister would come out when she was hungry enough. Grace looked at her friend and said that she still had more pressing problems. Grace asked how the rumors about her mother were going. Valeria looked at her friend and said that everything remained the same. And as she said last time, almost no one knows these rumors because it was a long time ago. Grace looked at the young lady and said that her task was to find people who know about this, and that DGM's why she gave her this business with Silk. She asked her friend if she was embarrassed about it, just because the business was going well. Valeria was shocked. She looked at Grace and said that she was not shy. Valeria looked at her friend in surprise and asked how she could say such a thing. Valeria thought that it would be easy to find people who knew the rumors through her connections, but it turned out to be more difficult than she thought. Valeria looked at her friend and asked if she didn't have any information from Isabel March. Valeria asked, why don't she visit them? Grace thought for a moment. She had actually thought about visiting them, but they had barely kept in touch over the years. Grace knew that she couldn't just visit them without a reason, because she was the heiress of Winston, not after her father kicked her mother out of the family. So Grace looked at her friend and said that she would still have to visit them one day after, at the estate, everything will be settled. Grace looked at the young lady and said that this was her body, and as for Valerie, she needed to get information in any way she could. The maids knocked on Milady's door, but did not receive an answer. They said that she should eat, since fasting was not good for her health. They were very worried about her. The maid looked puzzled at her colleague and said that this is already the 4th day that Lady Cadia has been skipping food, and she could get seriously ill if she doesn't eat anything. Her friend was puzzled because she did not listen to them. The young lady in turn was quietly crying in Cadia May's room. She was scared because she remembered the words of her sister, who told her not to even think about resisting her. The young lady was very angry at her sister and screamed at her to get out of her thoughts. She was puzzled and didn't know what to do in this situation, because she knew that no one would want to get involved with her in high society as soon as this situation became known to people. Cadia was shocked because she knew that such rumors would not only spread in the upper-class society, but would also spread throughout the entire empire. She understood that everyone in the empire would despise her. but she thought that maybe everything would happen differently. Cadia knew that her witch sister Grace could simply kill her before this happened. The young lady was trembling with fear. She knew that a sword was already presented to her throat. She was at a loss and did not know what to do in this situation. Grace walked into her sister's room and with a smile told her sister to stop fussing over something so insignificant. Grace said, "What's wrong?" Who tried to set her up. The young lady suddenly screamed loudly with tears in her eyes, as she did not expect Grace to come to her. She looked at her sister in surprise and asked why she was so scared, since she was, and you, DJ meant even chasing her. A moment later, she looked around the room and was horrified because it was in complete chaos. Grace said that it looks like her sister will soon turn into a poltergeist who will haunt this room. Grace said that it is even surprising that she hasn't even seen cockroaches here. Yet the young lady closed herself off from her sister because she didn't want Grace to come close to her. She looked at her in surprise and with a grin told her sister to just look at herself. Grace said that she knew that she had the brain of a goldfish. The young lady looked intently at her sister. She didn't know what to do or what to do. Grace smiled and said that now her sister even looks like a fish. The young ladies looked at their sister in surprise and puzzlement and asked why she came to her, since she did not expect to see her at all. Grace looked at the maid in surprise and asked if she was sure that her mistress had not eaten for 4 days, since she was still screaming very loudly. The young lady looked at the maid and said that she could go there and she would feed her herself. The maid obediently agreed. Cadia looked at her sister in fear and asked what she was planning to do now. Grace looked at her sister and said that she didn't eat, didn't go to class, and didn't even show up at social events. Grace told her sister that she might as well explain to the world that something was going on. Cadia looked closely at her sister. She knew that it was all because of her, but she could not utter a word. Grace looked at her and said that she was scared. Grace said that she might hit rock bottom and never rise again. She said that everything was very interesting on her part because Cadia was not afraid to plot against her. Cadia would like to object, but was unable to. Grace said that she was sure that Madame Mariel was the one who did it. Grace looked at her sister with contempt and said that after all she herself ordered her to do it. The young lady bowed down, so she could not object to her sister Gum's words. Grace had some plans in case sister continued to resist, but she would no longer have to resort to using them. Grace looked at her sister and said that if someone is not wise, he should at least be brave, but she is neither the same. Grace told her sister that she is completely useless to her, and it is a pity that she still has to take care of her. Cadia looked at her with fury, her sister, and said that she never left her to take care of her. Looking at her sister, Grace said that she is Winoston, and that means that she is obliged to take care of her. Grace told her sister that in the end, everything she enjoys here comes from her, down to the smallest detail. Cadia looked at her sister and asked what she was trying to say. With this, Grace looked at Cadia and said with a grin that she wanted her to show her worth. Grace came closer to her and said that she had an interesting offer for her. Grace told Cadia that despite the fact that she is Winoston, she behaves more rudely than the daughter of the lowest baron. Grace said with a grin that she would hire the best teachers for her and fire all her teachers and governesses, except Mrs. Amast. Grace said that instead she would have the best professors from the academy as her private tutors. Cadia was taken aback. She was confused and did not understand what her sister was talking about. Grace told her that she wants her to master academic knowledge, manners, eloquence, foreign languages, music, and art in the shortest possible time. Grace said that after that, she wants her sister to be the center of all tea parties. Looking at her sister, Grace said that she would like all the nobles of the imperial palace to worship her. Cadia froze in bewilderment. Grace looked at her sister and said that she was giving her a chance to reach the top of high society. Cadia was confused. She did not understand what her sister was talking about, since just a few days ago, she tried to kill her with her own hands. Grace looked at her sister's confused face, with a smile on her face. Moving closer to her, Grace said that she would not defeat her anyway, so now she gives her a hint that this is the only way she can survive. Besides, what she is giving her, right now, she will need to rise higher. Grace said that in exchange for all this, all she wants in return is her eternal devotion. Grace yawned and said that she forgot that word. But a moment later she said with a smile that she remembered this word. And this word is obedience. Gray, looking at her sister, said that she wanted her to obey her unquestioningly. Grace understood that if she trained Cadia correctly, she could become her new informant in high society and replace Valeria. Grace knew that to do this, she would first have to understand that she would become nothing if the Winoston house went downhill. Grace looked at her sister with a grin and said that of course she was free to accept or decline her offer. Grace looked at her and told Cadia to remember that she doesn't care about people she doesn't care about. Cadia looked at her sister and asked what would happen if she responded to such a proposal. Grace said that in that case, she would marry her off to some random nobleman. She told Cadia that she really had no choice in the matter. Grace looked at her sister and said with a smirk that since she was her family, she would do her a favor and try to find someone beautiful. Cadia angrily shouted at her sister to forget about it. Grace asked her sister if she could lower her tone, since her patience was limited. The young lady was very frightened and covered her mouth with her hands as fast as lightning. Grace said that she gave her enough time to think about it, but also told her to remember that if she loses her patience, then it will no longer be about her alone, and she will turn her attention to her mother, and perhaps she tried to force the head maid to kill the heiress. Grace said with a grin about her sister that this intrigue works both for her and for her mother. Cadia angrily shouted at her sister not to contact her mother. Grace said that it only depends on her actions. Cadia understood that Lady Valeria was right, but she didn't believe her then. She knew that the scary thing about you to her sister is that she has abilities, and she can easily use anyone as a piece on her chessboard. The young lady greeted the crown princess courteously. The princess smiled and greeted the young lady in return, and also asked for forgiveness for last time. Her Highness the Crown Princess smiled and once again asked for forgiveness for what happened last time. The princess said that she heard that something happened to the young lady. She asked if she was okay. Grace bowed obediently and thanked the princess for worrying about her. She said that it was just a minor incident and that someone had poisoned her cake. The princess frowned for a moment and said that she could not say that it was a minor incident. Since she heard that the head maid was behind this incident, the princess asked if she was executed. Looking at the princess, she said that it would be so, and she would serve a life sentence in Bern prison. The princess looked intently at the young lady and said that she understood everything. The princess said that in the last few days, all she could think about was Richard's injury. The princess, looking at the young lady, asked for forgiveness and said that she should have known earlier how she was feeling. Grace looked at the princess and asked if the Viscount was seriously injured. The princess, frowning, said that he fell from his horse at the foot of the cliff. Fortunately, he survived, but there were moments when they thought that he might not survive. Grace knew that Richard would probably be especially careful at the cliff. Richard graduated from the academy with excellent achievements, and he was once part of the Knights of the Princess Heiress. Grace, in turn, knew that he may have left the Order of Knights, but could not forget the skills that he acquired as a knight for a moment. She remembered a conversation with her friend who said that it could be them, namely the House of Monasca. The young lady looked at the princess and asked if there were any signs that magic had been used to cause the Viscount to fall from his horse. For a moment the princess frowned and thought about it, but a few minutes later she said that they couldn't be sure about it. The princess said that if it was true, it would indeed be very problematic, but they can't waste their time and energy on something they don't even have evidence of. Grace brought up that the princess had her own thoughts on this matter, and she no longer wanted to interfere in this matter. Bowing, she told the princess that she was right. A moment later, the princess looked intently at the young lady and called to her, The princess looked at Grace and asked if Rick behaved decently at the banquet in honor of the holiday. The young lady smiled, looking at the princess, and said that he behaved well. Grace said that in fact, he cured her of poison, so now she owes him a favor. The princess looked at the young lady in surprise. She asked if the young man really cured her of poison. She said that it was very surprising. The princess knew that the young lady would never ask him for help, and the Duke is also not the one who helps anyone without a reason. The princess smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that now she knows what the young man is capable of doing. The princess said that she hopes that they can count on each other on a friend during their investigation. The young lady looked at the princess in surprise because she did not think that they would investigate the case together. Grace asked the princess if she was talking about the case of missing redheads in the kingdom. The princess said that it was, and that was the reason why she returned to the palace early this morning. The young lady understood that something serious had to happen if the princess had to urgently return on short notice. The princess said that she thinks that a magician is behind this case of rash of missing people. The young lady looked at the princess in surprise and asked if there was any reason to assume such a thing. The princess said that, in the last incident, a child had disappeared from inside the house. The young lady was in shock. She wondered how someone could disappear inside the house. She said that it sounded really suspicious. The princess sighed heavily and said that there was no sign of the house being broken into. The knights were investigating the matter, but they could not find any signs that someone had entered physically. Grace looked closely at the princess and said that it looks like it means that you were a magician. The princess looked at the young lady and, sighing heavily, said that this is so, and it seems that only a capable magician was involved in this matter. Grace looked at the princess and asked if there was a magician behind all the missing people. Why wasn't this the first thing anyone had investigated? The princess said that there was another big problem. There was no trace of the use of magic crime. Grace sighed heavily and said that then they went back a step. The princess agreed with her and said that this was the problem. The princess looked closely at the young lady and said that it was for this reason that she called her here. She looked at the princess. The princess said that she would like the young lady and Rick to work together and find out who is behind these disappearances. The princess said that the young lady is ideal for this job, since she is the most experienced knight in the royal guard. The princess said that she would like the young lady to save the missing and bring peace to the empire. The young lady bowed and said that she would follow her orders. Grace was puzzled, as she understood that the Duke of Monasca could be involved in this matter, so she had better investigate it thoroughly. Rick sighed puzzled and said that there were no traces at all, and they wouldn't find any evidence here. Leon looked at his master and said that the child had disappeared from home. The Duke looked around the room puzzled and said that he knew everything and understood it. The Duke knew that he couldn't interrogate every mage on the continent. He just needed to see if there was any residual mana left here one last time. The Duke sighed heavily and said that they were again going to join some noisy. Leon looked at the gentleman in surprise and asked for forgiveness because he did not understand what the gentleman was talking about. A moment later, the young lady came into the room and said that it was very ridiculous of him. She asked if he was talking about her. He said something about a noisy. Grace looked at the young man and asked again if he really meant her. Rick was a little puzzled, since most people usually suffer greatly from poisoning, even if they have resistance to it. But he noticed that the young lady seemed to have fully recovered from the poisoning, without any consequences. He noticed that not only did she have a steely character, but she also seemed to have unique physical abilities. The young man looked intently at the young lady and said that she still had to admit that she was a very noisy person, and she could not deny it. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. She smiled and asked what was wrong with Togo. If she was noisy, she wanted to know what he was going to do about it. She smiled and said that whether she was noisy or not, he would still have to investigate this matter with her. She smiled and said that if he had any complaints about this, then he should not be shy and tell her. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked if something would change if he did this. The young lady smiled her radiant smile and said that, of course not. He looked at her puzzled and said that then he had no complaints about her. The young lady came closer to him and said that it would be wise of him to decide not to make useless efforts. He looked at her in surprise and said that last time she said that he was a fool because he didn't try. She said that back then she had nothing to gain from it. She said that as much as possible, she wants everyone in the world to lose all desire to win when they encounter her. The young man looked at her with his mouth open in surprise. Grace smiled and asked if he really had a problem with this. The young man was confused. He didn't attempt to understand how she could be so immune to criticism. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she was so obsessed with winning in everything. Grace smiled and said that it was all because she likes to win. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she then copes with defeat. Grace, with a radiant smile, said that she never loses at all. She said that she prefers to win dishonestly than to lose fairly. She said that she always wins no matter what. The young man sighed heavily. He realized that he just had to stop trying to understand her. He decided to miss this moment, and looking at the young lady, asked if she knew the details of the case. She came closer to him and said that she remembered all the details on the way here, and he should still check the files as well. The young man came closer to her and looked at her in surprise, as he felt that the smell of jasmine was coming from her. Looking at the young lady, he wondered if she was wearing perfume. He noticed that today's perfume was different from the one she wore at the banquet. The young lady said that magicians were involved, which meant that it could be quite dangerous when she started talking. He came to his senses a little. The Duke said that she still had nothing to worry about. She looked at him and said that she knew that she was quite an experienced fighter, but still she would not be able to fight a group of magicians all alone. He smiled and said that she still looked like she could handle a whole group of magicians. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. She asked why not try it on the nearest magician first. The young man looked away from her for a moment and chuckled. The young lady was surprised because she did not expect such emotions from him. She did not understand why he was laughing now. Looking at the documents, she said that in any case, this does not change the fact that this is a very dangerous business, and, besides, she needs to worry about the redheads in her house. He looked at the young people in surprise and asked if she meant the Duchess and her daughter. He was perplexed and asked the young lady who would dare to break into the Duke's house. The young lady, thoughtful, said that no one knows what could happen next. She told him to just think about the victims of this case. First, there was a prostitute, Tom, a beggar, a herbal dealer, and a child. The criminals started the crime from hidden alleys, and now it is happening on the main street. She asked him, doesn't him mo? It seemed does he know that the crime scene is spreading from the hidden parts of society to ordinary people. She asked him what he would say if the next time a nobleman gets hurt. She said that her sister could also become a target. The young man was a little surprised because he thought that she was on bad terms with her sister. He was under the impression that she would have broken that one long ago young lady, but it seemed to him that she was worried about her sister. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was looking at her like that. Looking at the young people, the young man asked for forgiveness and said that he had talked with the parents of the missing boy, and they told him that the man who came to repair their pipes 2 months ago was really Zach. The lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he was sure of this. The young man said that he was completely sure of this. It took several days until they were able to look into this issue because the parents of the missing boy simply could not calm down. But as soon as he showed them the portrait of the young man, the father confirmed that he had come home to them. The Duke thought for a moment and said that he knew about it. Zach has been involved in every disappearance case so far. There must be something they don't know that they can extract from him. He thought he should follow Zach up again. The young lady looked at the Duke in surprise and asked if Zach was the repairman who had been at all the crime scenes so far. Rick confirmed her guesses. The young lady said that she understood everything, and then it would be better to focus the investigation on him. And if they need help, they can ask the princess. The knight looked at the lady and said that someone was here with a message for her. The young lady looked at the man in surprise and asked who it could be. A moment later, looking out the window, she saw that the carriage belonged to her family. Elena, shaking with fear, looked at the young lady in fear. Grace was surprised because she did not expect to see her maid at the scene of the incident. The maid looked at her mistress and shouted that they were in big trouble. The young lady, surprised and dumbfounded, looked at the maid and asked what happened. Elena said that Lady Ionel Monasca was walking towards their estate and said that she had come to meet Lady Cadia. Grace was stunned by what she heard. Grace looked at the maid and asked if the guest really said that she wanted to see her sister. Elena said that everything was exactly like that, and the young lady brought some strange box with her. The young lady looked at her friend and told him to continue investigating. She said that she would go to the palace later and see him there. He looked at her in surprise, but a moment later, he said that there was no need for that. He said that it was still easier for him to investigate alone anyway, so she should still return home. The young lady agreed with him and told him to send her a message. If anything happened, he will need. The young man was surprised and did not understand why the young lady was in such a hurry to get home. He wondered if she really thought that Ionel Monasca could harm her sister. He was confused and simply did not understand her. The young lady flew into the estate with their lightning speed. Looking at the butler, she asked where Ionel was. The butler bowed politely and said that the young lady was now in the room with Lady Cadia. Grace, in turn, was very angry. The maid hurriedly ran to her mistress and called her. The young lady looked at the butler and told him to open the door. A moment later, the young lady came into my room and saw the uninvited guest. Ionel looked at Grace with a grin and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Grace was furious. Looking at the young lady, she didn't to understand why she came over to them like that. Grace looked at her with fury and asked how she dared to invade their home. The young lady said with a grin that the Duke's new daughter held a birthday banquet, but she couldn't attend it, and now she came to give her a gift because she was sorry that she missed such a grand banquet. Grace looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what kind of gift she was talking about. Grace asked if she had really brought a dead rat. The young lady looked at Grace with a grin and told her not to be so evil. Grace said that she had her reasons for this. She said that the young lady's hobby was getting rid of everyone who got on her nerves. Grace said that thanks to her sophisticated hobby, she was even expelled from the military academy. Grace looked at her and said with a grin that she was expelled after all from the academy because of her dating problems. The young lady looked at Grace and said with a fierce grin that she could see Grace was still as sarcastic as ever. Grace looked at her sister and called her because she wanted to end this farce as quickly as possible. Cadia looked at her sister warily and puzzled. Grace looked at her with a serious look and said that Beta left them alone. The young lady was puzzled and did not know what to do in this situation. A moment later, Ionel called Lady Cadia, and she looked at her intently. The young lady said with a smirk that she could take her gift first before leaving. The young lady said that she should not give up the good intentions and wishes of the House of Monascus, even if she herself became the daughter of a duke. Grace looked at her sister and told her to just leave because they always refused everything that the Monasca house offered, so nothing would change, even if she refused her. The young lady said that Cadia was new to high society, and she didn't want people to talk about how arrogant she was. Ionel looked at the young lady and asked if she was telling the truth. Grace Dogs looked at her sister with rage and told her to leave their company immediately. Cadia looked at the young lady puzzled and said that if that was the case, she would just take the gift and leave Grace in turn. Shouted to her sister not to do this. The young lady just touched the gift and suddenly some animal flew at her. She was in shock and very scared. A moment later, she stopped short as nothing happened. She opened her eyes in surprise and looked at what happened. A moment later, she saw her sister, who was holding some kind of monster in her hand, and her hand was bleeding. She was in shock, as she had never seen anything like this before, and wondered if it was a demonic monster. Ionel was in shock. She screamed with rage. She could not understand and believe what Grace had already done to her Catherine. Grace looked at her guest in surprise and asked if she couldn't think of a better name than that. The young lady looked at Grace with rage and asked how she dared to kill her beloved pet. Grace looked at the young lady with surprise and bewilderment and asked what she had to do. She asked if she really should have let this demonic monster attack her sister. The young lady was furious and wondered who even cared about some commoner who crawled out of God knows where. Grace shouted to her maid to take her sister to the room. Now Cadia looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes. She was shocked that she called her a commoner. Elena entered the room and approached the young lady. She said that it was time for her to go to her room. Ionel looked at Grace and said with a grin that she cares about her sister. And this is very unexpected. She asked Grace how lonely she was, that she mistook such a commoner for her sister. The young lady told Grace that she was very sorry for her. Grace said that she has enough strength to take care of people, different from Ionel, and she is not at all a weakling who needs protection. The young lady looked at Grace with fury and asked what she was talking about. Grace said that she had the full support of the Duke simply because she was his eldest daughter, but in fact, she had achieved nothing on her own. Grace said that he helped her get into the military academy, despite her only skills, only to see how she drove herself out of messing with boys. The young lady glared at Grace and told her to take back her words. Grace looked at her and said with a grin that she was very interested in why her little brother had not killed her, yet she said that she would kill her and become the heir herself if she were her brother. The young lady directed her magic at her and angrily told her to keep talking and see what happens next. Grace managed to intercept the young lady and grabbed her by the neck and slammed her against the wall. Grace angrily said that they were warning her and she had better not go near her house again. Grace looked at her with rage and asked if she understood her. The young lady looked at the dirt with a grin and asked how dare she do this to her. She said that she would still have to answer for this. Grace looked at her angrily and asked what she accounted for. Grace asked if the young lady didn't understand what she would have to answer for bringing a demonic monster into their home. The young lady asked with a grin if she had proof of this. Grace, in turn, told the young lady to shut her mouth, as her sister Winostin Ionel said with a smirk that she was with unclean blood in her veins. She looked at Grace and said that she herself was no better than her. She asked Grace if she still didn't understand it. Grace looked at her and said with a grin that if things didn't seem fair, they could try one of her spells. Ionel looked at the young lady with fury and told her not to think that she wouldn't do it. Grace looked at her with contempt and said that of course she thought so, since she was after all the great and magnificent Lady Manaska. Grace looked at her and said that perhaps she should remember something, namely, that she was in the land of the Winostans. Grace said that she is not a merciful person at all, and if someone attacks her on her own land, she will never let them get away alive. Ionel looked at the young lady and said with a grin that she would see how long this precious Winostan estate would last. Grace looked at the young lady in bewilderment. She wondered if the lady had finally gone completely mad. Grace looked at her and said with a smirk that she would pay dearly for getting into conflict with her sister. Grace said that she suggested that she worry about her future before taking care of hers. Ionel, looking at the young lady, said that she would bitterly regret this soon. A moment later she used magic, and in the blink of an eye, she disappeared. The young lady opened the door and told the butler to send an official warning to you, to the estate of the Duke of Manascus, as they need to tell him that they will show them why they are keeping their knights in the area if anyone from his family tries to contact them again. Raising her head, she was a little surprised because she did not expect that the butler would not be there. She looked at her sister in surprise and asked what was happening. Grace looked at her sister in bewilderment and asked why she was here. Cadia looked intently at her sister and called her. Cadia looked at her sister and asked if the young lady had left. Grace looked at her sister with bewilderment and asked if she meant Lady Ionel. Cadia lost her head. In fear, she looked at her sister from under her brows and asked what it was earlier. She asked if it really was a demonic beast. The young lady looked at her sister and, sighing heavily, said that is how it all happened. Cadia looked at the young lady, dumbfounded. She was very scared. A moment later, she fell on her knee in front of her sister and asked what was wrong with her. She was in shock and wondered why the young lady did this to her. Cadia was in shock and did not know why everyone was so cruel to her. She was shaking with tears before our eyes. Grace looked at her in confusion, as she didn't know what to say. She sighed heavily and said that she felt the same way a few weeks ago, and she couldn't understand why everyone was teasing her. Cadia looked at her sister with rage and shouted why they all have problems with her. Grace looked closely at her sister and asked if she really thought she was so important. Grace asked her if she thought they were only cruel to her. The young lady said that this was not the case, and that high society had always been like that. Cadia said, puzzled, that this means everyone in high society must be monsters. The young lady looked at her sister with a grin and said that it still took her a long time to understand this. Grace asked her sister if she had found a way to survive among these monsters. Cadia did not answer anything to this question. That exactly everything was happening as she thought, because people almost never change. Cadia was very angry because the life she dreamed of was shattered, and her sister wanted her to serve her, but she knew that she would never will do something like this. A moment later, sitting on the ground, the young lady saw a ring in front of her. She looked at it in surprise and asked her sister what it was. Grace looked at her sister and said that lately redheads have been disappearing in the capital. She said that she didn't think that anyone would dare to harm them, but she would still prefer to know where she is. Grace said that the heiress's jewelry has a tracking spell. She needs to know where Cadia will end up so that she can at least bring her body back and bury her in the family crypt if she is killed. The young lady was very frightened and did not know what her sister wanted to say. Sister Grace looked sideways at her sister. She saw that at least she wanted to survive. Grace looked at the butler and said that she wanted him to check the location of all her accessories every day, using a tracking spell, and inform her about them. The butler bowed politely and said that he would do everything, and a moment later, after bandaging the Lady VDJ-TM's wound, he left her. Grace sighed heavily and said that she would go now. But suddenly someone called her, and she looked around in bewilderment. The Duchess looked intently at the young lady and asked if she had some time. Grace looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she did not expect that she would want to talk to her. Grace looked at the Duchess in surprise and asked why she needed her. The Duchess smiled and said that she would like to suggest having a cup of tea together sometime later. Grace finally agreed to her proposal. Sometime later, they were sitting on the terrace together and drinking tea. The Duchess smiled and said that this tea had just arrived a few days ago. The Duchess asked if the young lady liked its aroma. Grace thought for a moment and said that the tea was not bad. The Duchess smiled and said that she was very glad to hear this. The Duchess looked at the young lady and asked how she was feeling. Grace, in turn, looked at her in surprise. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and said that she was poisoned just a few days ago. She asked Grace if she was all right now. Grace looked at the Duchess in bewilderment. She didn't know if she was really worried about her. A moment later, Grace said that she was fine and had completely recovered. The Duchess smiled and said that she was very glad to hear this, and it was a relief for her. The Duchess told the young lady that she should tell her if she felt unwell. Grace looked at her in bewilderment and asked if there was something she wanted to talk about. The Duchess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she really wanted to ask her about Madame Marille. Grace, in turn, guessed that the Duchess hadn't just invited her to tea. The Duchess looked at the young lady and said that she did not think that she should ask her about Madame The Duchess said that, in the end, Madame did something that she should never have done to a child. Grace looked at the Duchess and said that she was not a child. The Duchess, in turn, looked at the young lady and said that after all she was still a child, and at her age she thought that love was all she saw, and she acted like a fool because she was blinded by it. Sweet fantasy. Grace looked at her with a gaze and said that the nobles were completely different. The Duchess said that this may be true, but for them, they always remained children. Grace was confused and did not understand what she wanted to say to these duchesses. The Duchess said that she knew that her daughter treated her with a certain hostility. The Duchess said that she tried to stop her, but she did not listen to her. Grace looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The Duchess said that, after all, it was her fault that she never punished her. She had to thank Grace for forgiving her daughter, and she really meant it. Grace was surprised because she realized that her sister had someone who apologized for her when she did something bad. Grace knew that her mother would reprimand her very harshly if she did something like that. Grace said that she had not forgiven her sister at all. If she will do something similar, and again, then she will not pass by next time. Grace never liked sweet tea, perhaps, because the tea was too sweet. The Duchess looked at the young lady and said with a smile that she had given her a chance to correct her mistakes, and that was forgiveness in itself. Grace knew that it still left a bitter aftertaste, and it was also bitterness envy that her sister has such a mother. But nevertheless, she would never have achieved such success if she had behaved the same way she did. Here looked closely at the Duchess and said with a grin on her face that she heard that she had lost some memories. The Duchess said that it was true that she felt better after she moved here, but she still couldn't remember what happened that night. The Duchess said that she had lost all memories associated with her mother. At first, she tried to stop her father so that he would not be so harsh towards her mother. The Duchess said that she told the Duke not to rush, as there was no way to confirm the stranger's testimony. Grace looked intently at the Duchess and said that it seemed like her father didn't listen. The Duchess said that it was true, but her mother also packed her things and left 2 days later. Grace looked at the Duchess with bewilderment and shock. The Duchess said that her father said that her mother left because of guilt. The Duchess said that she was not so sure about that. Grace knew that her mother would never have left in this way if the truth had done something wrong, especially if her alleged victim had lost her memory, and there was no clear evidence. Grace knew that she would have stayed until her return. She guessed that there was something fishy about this matter. The Duchess looked at the young lady and called her to the Duchess, smiled a soft smile, and said that she was very glad that they talked together. The Duchess said she always wanted to talk to her. The young lady looked at the Duchess in surprise, as she was very surprised that she said something like that. The Duchess smiled and said that everything was true, as Grace looked just like Ryan, so she wondered if she only looked like him in appearance. But it turned out that she was just as stubborn as him. Grace looked at the Duchess intently, as she was not very pleased to discuss this. Grace said that anyway all she heard about Madame Marille was that she was punished according to her crime. The Duchess sighed heavily and said that she understood everything. Grace looked at the insolent genius and asked if there was anything else that she would like to discuss with her. The Duchess smiled and said that there were no more questions, and also thanked the young lady for her time. Grace looked at the Duchess and said that there was nothing to thank her, for she said that when the new maid comes to them at the estate, the Duchess must learn to be strict and unyielding with the servants, that although it is nice to be close to those who serve you, it can also upset the hierarchy in noble house. The Duchess looked closely at the young lady and nodded, saying that she would try to do everything. The young lady politely said goodbye to the Duchess. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting in her office, and a young lady came in, knocking. Grace greeted Linda Dwyle with a smile on her face. Linda looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she had already woken up. Linda said that it was still very early. Grace smiled and said that it was a lot of work and she couldn't sleep last night. Grace said that in any case, she was very glad that the young lady decided to join her. Linda smiled and said that there was something she needed to ask before officially accepting this job. Linda asked the young lady if she really was going to abide by all the conditions of employment described in this letter. Grace smiled and said that of course she would do so. Grace said that she offered her 3 times the salary of an assistant at the academy, as well as generous bonuses, and in 2 years, she would be able to buy an estate in the capital. Linda smiled and said that this was a very wonderful offer, but still she was more interested in the last part. Grace smiled and asked if she really meant her recommendation for the post of future Minister of Finance. Grace said that of course she would give her recommendation and asked the greatest princess for a letter of appointment from the emperor. Grace said that in return she would be sure that no one in this house would challenge her. Grace said that she did not want anyone to find a vulnerability here. The young lady bowed politely and said that she would do everything. She smiled and said that it was an honor to have Lady Grace at her service. The young man sat quietly in the imperial palace and watched the silence while looking out the window. A moment later, Grace approached him and greeted him with a smile. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing here when he had a great room with a beautiful view. The young man sighed heavily and said that he liked it here. She looked at him in surprise and said that he was really strange. The young man, in turn, looked closely at the young lady as he smelled a pleasant aroma of fruit and blood from her. Although looking at her, he did not see any wound. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really owned a perfume business or something like that. The young lady looked at him in surprise because she didn't understand what he was talking about. He said that it seems like she wears different perfumes every day. The young lady was surprised because she didn't understand how he noticed this. She looked at him in surprise and asked if there was some kind of problem with this. The young man sighed heavily and said that magicians don't jammed like anything artificial. Grace said that Enel has heavier aromas than her. The young man said that magicians are fixated on something besides magic, such as power or fame. They have problems in this regard. Monascas have long forgotten the true essence of being a magician. The young lady looked at him in surprise and said that it was a surprise for her. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she meant. She said that he was rarely so serious. He came closer to her and clearly smelled blood. A moment later, looking at the young lady, he asked if she had been hurt. Grace looked at him intently and said that she was not hurt. The young man looked at her in bewilderment. He wondered why she was trying to hide it. He sighed heavily and thought that most likely it was none of his business. The young lady looked intently at the young man and asked, "What about the repairman named Zach?" Rick said that they were trying to track all his activities, but they managed to find some. The young lady thought for a moment and said that it had been over a month since he had been around these missing people, and said that they should stop following him and confront him instead. Rick looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Now he asked why she intended to irritate him. Grace looked at him and asked how long he would keep an eye on him. She said that nothing had come of it. Yet Rick said that there was a high risk of a direct collision with him. The young lady said that she knows about it, but she is still sure that he understands that watching him from afar will not solve anything. Grace looked at the young man intently and said that she was not trying to make things worse. She was just saying that they should visit him. Rick looked at her intently and said that he understood what she wanted to say, but he could warn the culprit. The young lady looked at him and said that she understood this, and that's why they should keep him in sight. At least her idea is better than what they are doing now. The Duke understood that the young lady had her own arguments, but there was a big risk. Grace came closer to him and said with a smile that even if he did, Tim, want to go with her. The young man was stunned because she came very close to him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she wanted. Grace smiled and said that she would go there with him or without him. The story about the magician who refused to help her will spread far and wide. Rick looked at her in surprise and with a smirk wondered if this was the best she could do. He wondered if she was threatening him with her position of nobility. The young lady looked at him intently and said with a grin that this would indeed attract the interest of many nobles. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she meant. Grace smiled and said that everyone would want to know about the recklessly brave magician who refused to help the infamous Lady Grace, and the family when Austen survived. She smiled and said she hoped he liked getting everyone's attention. Grace said people would look at him everywhere. She said that some might even go and talk to him. She looked at him with a grin and said that she hoped it wouldn't bother him too much. The young man was furious, as he hated it most when strangers bothered him. She said with a grin that in fact they could even come to his house. Rick looked at the young lady and said that she could go and do it. He looked at the young lady as he realized that she knew a lot about intimidating people. He looked at her and told her to promise him that he would follow her when they got to the alleys. She smiled and agreed with him, said that she also didn't might want to be careless. She had never been in the alleys. He looked at her in surprise and said that she looked like she was killing bandits for breakfast. The young lady looked at him in surprise and dumbfounded and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, the young man threw his cloak over her. The young lady looked at her in bewilderment. The Duke looked intently at the lady and told her to forget about the investigation. He said that with such a face, she would not get anywhere in the alleys. He said that at least she should wear a cloak. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he would do. The Duke smiled and said that everything would be fine with him. Moreover, they would not travel by carriage. Grace looked at him in surprise and asked how they would travel. A moment later, he used magic, and they immediately moved.